Chapter 580. Fan Xian's reaction was fast enough. Like a shadow, he charged over and pushed the eldest princess to the ground. His fingers moved like the wind. In a flash, he used Jinqi to forcefully seal a few major meridians around her wound. However, he still found that a faint black aura had already slowly enveloped her bright face. This black dagger had been stuck in Li Yunrui's abdomen for a while. However, it had been covered by the wide sleeves, so Fan Xian had not seen it. What shocked him even more was that the eldest princess was still able to speak to him so freely with a dagger in her abdomen. She did not reveal a glimmer of pain and successfully hid it from his eyes. During this time, the poison had already flowed through her entire body along with her blood. It had entered her heart and faintly floated to her face. Even if Fei Jie appeared in Jingdo right now, he would not be able to save her life. Fan Xian lowered his head and looked helplessly at the dagger in her abdomen. Looking at the hilt of the dagger, he couldn't help a slight chill in his heart because it looked familiar. However, this was not the time to worry about such things. He supported the eldest princess' shoulder with one hand and pressed the other against her soft abdomen. The heart of Tianyi Dao he had inherited from northern Qi was poured in without hesitation. After a long while, the eldest princess, who had been silent without a trace of pain, finally frowned. She looked at him with a reproachful gaze and said, "I just wanted to savor the taste of pain and death. Why did you disturb me?" She had always been high and lofty. As the little princess of the royal family, she was loved by her parents and brothers. Who dared to make her suffer? Other than the Empress Dowager's 4 slaps and the Emperor's violent rage on that stormy night, Li Yunrui truly did not know what it was like to have pain sink into the marrow. These words were said somewhat crazily, but Fan Xian did not have the leisure to bicker with her. Silently, he poured in Jinqi and forced the poison in her body to one place. Gradually, the faint black color on Li Yunrui's face grew thicker and thicker. It then gathered toward her temples. The skin on the other parts of her face returned to its usual brightness. Fan Xian gave a muffled grunt. His right palm patted her soft abdomen. Li Yunrui's red lips parted slightly. Immediately after, his left hand reached like lightning into his clothes and took out a pill, stuffing it into her mouth. He was very familiar with the poison on the dagger because he had made it, so the pill immediately took effect. However, Li Yunrui had covered it for too long. The poison had already entered her heart and could not be forced out. The sweat on Fan Xian's forehead poured out. He couldn't help but think of the movies and novels he had seen in his previous life. Those chilling scenes. His left hand gripped her shoulder tightly. "Where's Wan'er?" He yelled in a hoarse voice. "Where's DeBeo?" In those stories, after the male protagonist achieved the final victory, he would painfully discover that the enemy would not tell him where the relatives he had captured were hidden or if they were dead. This was to torture the male protagonist for the rest of his life. The dark and gloomy film and the separation of the fluorescent screen made Fan Xian afraid. His voice trembled, and he completely forgot how he should react. He angrily and helplessly roared at her. Li Yunrui glanced at him mockingly. Her brows moved slightly again. It looked like the poison on the dagger had completely entered her body. The sharp pain finally began to clearly attack her nerves. She lowered her head to look at the black dagger stuck in her abdomen and quietly said, "Don't always use your little cleverness and tricks. Those are things only useless people would use." Fan Xian's entire body was cold. He knew what the eldest princess meant by these words. The reason this black dagger was familiar to him was because he had made it himself. It was exactly the same as the dagger Sir Fei Jie had passed on to him when he was young. The medicine smeared on it was also the same. In the present world, there were 3 of these daggers. Fan Xian hid one in his boot, the third Prince Li Changping hid one in his boot, and the last one was hidden in Lin Debeo's boot. Of the people Fan Xian cared about, only the young Li Changping and the silly Bao had the least ability to protect themselves. Thus, he had carefully passed these 2 daggers to them, waiting for the final moment to deliver the most shocking blow to the enemy. In the palace, Li Changping had used this black dagger to protect his own life, while the Bao's black dagger was in the eldest princess's hands and in her abdomen. You thought I would use Dabao to threaten you. When Dabao was by my side, and you suddenly gave the order, he would pull out a dagger and stab me. Li Yunrui coughed up a trickle of blood and looked mockingly at Fan Xian. Of course, no one would seriously search a fat idiot, and no one would be on guard against him. Li Yunrui's gaze gradually dimmed. She slowly said, "You've been with Lin Dabao these years. Was it just for that moment? You told him I killed Lin Gong, so he hates that person called Li Yunrui. No one in the world dares to call my name in front of this idiot, other than you." She looked at Fan Xian like she was looking at an idiot, using too many little tricks, thinking too complicated and not generous at all. Fan Xian's entire body was cold. He had not thought that his last move would be so laughable in the other party's eyes and so easily seen through. He took a deep breath and forcefully suppressed the fear in his heart. Evenly, he begged, "Tell me, where are they?" Li Yunrui did not look at him. Her body gradually grew cold. Her shoulders unconsciously shrank back. "I am about to die. What is the need to leave Wanner alone in the world to be bullied by men? She is my wife. I will protect her." Li Yunrui's eyes looked to the side. In a trembling voice, she said, "I had wanted to kill your concubine, but I did not succeed. You will have many women in the future. Why should I let Wanner continue to suffer?" She turned her head and looked calmly into Fan Xian's eyes. "Don't worry. I won't use her life to force you to become an ascetic monk." Fan Xian's heart jumped slightly. He stared in a daze at the beautiful face in front of him. At this moment, the poison had all gathered on the two sides of her temples. Following her blood vessels, it turned into a few streaks of green, just like two green flowers at her temples. There was a strange beauty to it. Li Yunrui looked at him mockingly. She slowly raised her right hand and pulled Fan Xian over. She leaned weakly against his shoulder. Her face was close to his face, and her body was leaning against his. It appeared very intimate. She used this warm position to move closer to his ear and quietly say, "Why did the Qin family betray? Go ask Ping Ping. I can only guess." Even at death's door, this exceptional beauty still exhaled like orchids. Her slightly warm breath blew against Fan Xian's ear. It felt strangely charming. Of course, Fan Xian did not have any other thoughts. His eyes looked at the blue flower at the corner of his brow that was close at hand and listened to the voice gradually reaching his ears. The gaze in his eyes became more and more serious, more and more shocked, and more pained. Li Yunrui laughed lightly by his ear and said, "Although I am dead, to be able to leave behind the Emperor's most powerful enemy, presumably, a Qin kingdom without me would not be too bored." Fan Xian's mouth was dry. He couldn't speak for a moment. He could only lower his head disappointedly. Although he was silent, he still displayed a powerful hesitation and loss. "This is your mother's courtyard. I wanted to burn it down, but after thinking about it, I decided to leave it to you. This place is very beautiful. Most importantly, I think you need this place to understand some things. You won't let me down." Li Yunrui glanced at her son-in-law one last time and said with slight mockery, "You even want to use that idiot Dabao. In this world, there are only two people as shameless and hypocritical as you. One is the Emperor, and the other is you. So, I think very highly of you." At this time, Fan Xian's entire body was frozen. He did not hear the last words at all. Immediately after, a strange sound came from behind him. It made his heart jump. Turning around to look, he saw that the flowering tree behind the broken zither had moved, revealing a small hole below. In the hole were Wanner and Dabao. Both of them were tightly bound. Cloth had been stuffed into their mouths. It was impossible for them to speak. Wanner's eyes were slightly red. She looked at Fan Xian with a worried gaze. Seeing that Fan Xian was not injured, two clear lines of tears flowed down. Dabao's gaze had been blank. After he saw Fan Xian, it became filled with a silly smile. Immediately after, Wanner noticed her mother in Fan Xian's arms. She also noticed her mother's strange condition. Her eyes immediately filled with terror. Fan Xian had already pushed aside the eldest princess in his arms and rushed to the side of the tree. Lifting Wanner and Dabao up, he flicked his finger and cut the ropes binding them. Having escaped a great disaster, Wanner had no time to take out the cloth in her mouth. She rushed past Fan Xian and threw herself at the eldest princess's side. Kneeling by her side, she began to cry. Fan Xian sighed quietly in his heart and prepared to go over. He found that the corner of his clothes was being pulled on by someone. Turning his head to look, he saw Bao laughing foolishly and happily pulling on him as if he never wanted to let go again. Fan Xian's guilt swelled up. Shortly after, he felt a faint sorrow. Li Yunrui had been pushed to the ground by Fan Xian. The poison had long entered her heart. The 2 smears of poison on her forehead appeared increasingly azure. Contrasting with her delicate and white skin, it was like the beautiful blue and white flowers on fragile porcelain. However, these blue and white flowers were all poison. Just like her, even if she died, she wanted more people to die because of a few words she said. Wanted grabbed her mother's hand with one hand and took out the cloth stuffed in her mouth with the other. With a wail, she began to cry. Although this mother and daughter were very different from other mothers and daughters in the world and were not very close, they were, after all, connected by blood. In the last moment, Li Yunrui did not choose to use Wan Er's life to threaten Fan Xian. Wan Er looked at her dying mother and couldn't help but feel sorrow rise from her heart. She could not stop the grief and pain. Li Yunrui's icy right hand held her daughter's hand tightly. Smiling with difficulty, she raised her hand for the last time and pressed her temples together. It was as if she wanted to maintain her most beautiful image when she left this world. Her fingertips brushed past the wretched blue and white flowers, contrasting with a mocking smile at the corners of her lips. She didn't know who she was laughing at. Perhaps she was laughing at the fact that Fan Xian had held her in his arms earlier and then, as soon as he saw one, pushed her onto the grass with unusual cold-bloodedness. Perhaps she was thinking of the stormy night in the royal palace, that timid but affectionate nephew. Or perhaps she was thinking of her childhood stories from many years ago. Then, she smiled disdainfully and said her last 3 words in this world. Men, looking at the eldest princess gradually freezing body on the grass, Fan Xian's heart also gradually grew icy. He knew that the most powerful and ruthless enemy in his life had finally ended her life that was difficult to judge. Accurately speaking, from the Dong Mountain incident to the final Jingdo rebellion to the dagger in Taiping courtyard, Li Yunrui had only died to his hands. Her heart had long died. This was a strange and powerful woman. If Fan Xian didn't have that black chest, he would probably have long died to Yin Xiaoyi's hands. The entire situation in Jingdo would have long fallen into the eldest princess's control. In the end, she was a woman. She was not the most powerful person in the world. Compared to the unfathomable emperor, who no one knew how he had survived Dong Mountain, the eldest princess had a fatal weakness. Perhaps it could be said that she had one more weakness than the emperor, love. Perhaps this love was absurd and awkward, but it was still love. What was love in the world? It made people promise to live and die for it. When Yuan Haowen wrote these 2 lines, presumably, he had not thought that there were so many people in this world who used their actions to enrich the meaning of these 2 lines. There were infatuated children among people. Without question, the eldest princess was also an infatuated person. However, had she truly lost? In Fan Xian's eyes, it was not so. She had basically done everything she wanted to do in this life. Furthermore, the words she had quietly said by Fan Xian's ear at the end, although they didn't point anything out, had already planted a poisonous flower in Fan Xian's heart. It was just like the poisonous blue flower that appeared at the corner of her brows in the last moment of her life. Wan threw herself onto the eldest princess's body and cried endlessly. Linda Bao was behind Fan Xian, pulling on the corner of his clothes. He looked at this scene nervously and confusedly, thinking, the princess's mother is asleep, so why is my sister crying? The eldest princess's face was still beautiful, with long eyelashes and blue flowers at her temples. She was like a sleeping beauty waiting for someone to wake her with a kiss. Fan Xian looked at this scene. His heart was at a loss. He unconsciously spat out a somewhat unfamiliar phrase from his lips, Jesus cum Jesuus. This was a 14th century French poem. He remembered some fragments from a movie he had watched in his previous life. At this moment, Those words reappeared in his mind, exceptionally clear. This is how I am. This is how I am. This is how I was born. When I want to laugh, I laugh loudly. I love those who love me. This shouldn't be my weakness. Every time I love someone, every time I will love them. This is how I am. This is how I am. I was born to please others, and this is something that cannot be changed. I please those who make me happy. What can you do about this? I love someone, someone loves me. Like children in love. Jingdo sank into the greatest chaos. Although the Yi family and the imperial army had reduced the Qin family into crippled soldiers, driven them out of Jingdo, and controlled the 9 city gates, the situation in Jingdo was even more chaotic than before. However, the situation in Jingdo was even more chaotic than before. Earlier, when the two armies were facing off, the common people of Jingdo had all cowered under their beds in their homes, not daring to make a single sound. Now that the situation was beginning to become clear, the frightened and dejected citizens finally summoned their courage and fearfully surged toward the city gates. The common people of Jingdo often had their own poor relatives in the countryside outside the city. In such a dangerous moment, they wanted to think of a way to escape and hide. Otherwise, who knew whether or not the soldiers, who had gotten excited from the battle, would come and loot Jingdo after victory was decided? Their worry was not without reason. At least, in Jingdo, a few wandering soldiers and subordinates who did not have strict military discipline had begun to loot as they chased each other. The streets and alleys were in chaos. Women's screams rang out frequently. Occasionally, sparks would shoot into the sky. The Qing army's military discipline had always been strict. The chaos that had occurred was partly because of the terrible consequences that war would inevitably bring. It was also because this battle was an internal rebellion. Regardless of whether it was the Yi family, the Qin family, or the soldiers of the garrison, they all felt an indescribable sense of disillusionment. The darkest part of the human heart began to rise. Gong Dian did not lead his troops out of the city in pursuit. He immediately began to clean up the order in Jingdo. However, Jingdo was too big. It was impossible to completely control it in a short time. The common people of Jingdo could not wait for General Gong's cleansing operation. They knew the danger the remaining soldiers would cause after the battle. Putting their lives on the line, they surged toward the city gate that Gong Dian personally guarded. The scene was chaotic. The silent Fanxian was received by a small group of Dingzhou soldiers and Overwatch Council secret agents who had come out to receive him. He returned to Jingdo through another city gate, returning to his long-awaited home. He did not rush back to the palace or see Yizhong. Instead, he returned directly to the Fan Manor. He had no time to comfort Wan Er. He only asked about his father and King Jing's situation before pulling Tung Zijing to the side and giving him a few careful orders in a low voice. Ever since the Fan Manor had been surrounded, Tung Zijing had picked up a wooden stick and organized the guards and servants of the family to welcome the repeated edicts and harassment. Fortunately, Fan Jian was not in the manor, so the Fan Manor had not experienced any major attacks. The remaining soldiers were no match for the Fan Manor servants. Fan Jian had always been good at training soldiers. Tung Zijing listened to his young master's orders. His expression became cautious, and he nodded his head heavily. He didn't ask for the reason. He didn't take too many conspicuous Fan Manor servants with him. He quickly headed in the direction of the 28-li slope. The situation in Jingdo had long been settled. The Dingzhou army controlled the outside of the palace. Yizhong had very adroitly handed the defense of the royal palace back to the great prince. There were no organized rebel soldiers inside the city. The people who came were indeed from the Dingzhou army. An officer covered in blood pulled on the reins of his horse and scrambled toward Fanxian. In a panic, he said, "Duke, the commander has urgent news to report." There were countless fierce and powerful generals in the Qin kingdom. Each army habitually referred to their commander as commander, just like how the old soldiers of the Western Expedition Army referred to the great prince. Since this officer was from the Dingzhou army, the commander he spoke of was Yizhong. Fanxian was startled. He wondered if something had changed in Jingdo again. He had been anxious to see Yizhong. so he didn't say anything more. Pulling on the reins, he followed the small group of riders toward Donghua Gate. Along the way, he listened silently. Only then did he know exactly what had happened. Fan Xian listened to the officer's story and learned that while he was in Taiping Courtyard, Yi Zhong had been looking for him for a long time. Crown Prince Li Chengxian had been blocked by Yi Zhong at Donghua Gate. The two sides were facing off and in the middle of negotiations. For some reason, Li Chengxian had requested that he go see him. Although the Yi family had suddenly turned traitor, the rebel army was still powerful. The battle power of the remaining soldiers could not be underestimated. Fan Xian had not thought that the crown prince would be trapped in Jingdou. Inside the seemingly stable city, there was actually such a dangerous confrontation hidden under a quiet city gate. His pupils constricted slightly as he sucked in a breath of cold air. If the rebel army was chased out of Jingdou and fighting broke out in the field, it would have nothing to do with him. Naturally, the Yi family and the various armies loyal to the emperor would take over. But he was blocked at Donghua Gate. Why didn't the crown prince charge out? As he thought this, the horses' hooves did not stop. It didn't take long for them to forcefully disperse the Jingdou people crowding out of the city toward Jingyang Gate. Fan Xian and his group arrived in front of Donghua Gate. There was silence in front of Donghua Gate, a deathly silence. The Qin family rebel army, surrounded by the city gate department and Dingzhou soldiers, gripped the weapons in their hands tightly and looked nervously and hopelessly at the soldiers around them. In the center of the rebel army, the expressions of the Qin family generals had become very ugly. The two sides had been facing off at Donghua Gate for a full 2 hours. Under the crown prince's powerful restrictions, the rebel army did not launch a general attack toward Donghua Gate. They also did not launch a counterattack against the Dingzhou army. Yi Zhong, who was leading the Dingzhou army to surround this place, also displayed unusual patience. Just like this, he killed time and waited for the arrival of Fan Xian, who the crown prince had requested to be present. Yi Zhong was patient, but the generals of the rebel army waited like a year. Sweat flowed down their faces. However, they did not move rashly because defeat was like a mountain. If they truly fought, not many would survive. However, they also didn't know what the crown prince was thinking. This matter involved rebellion. How could they survive? Surrounded and protected by everyone, the crown prince, Li Chengxian's expression appeared particularly calm. He was only a little haggard, but he was not overly flustered. It was not until he saw Fan Xian coming from a distance that he sighed and seemed to calm down a little. The Dingzhou riders parted like a wave. Fan Xian rode alone through the street and came to Yi Zhong's side. Glancing at the crown prince, he furrowed his brows and didn't know what to say. Turning his head, he moved closer to Yi Zhong's ear and quietly said something. Yi Zhong's face lit up and his eyes lit up. Immediately after, he felt his heart palpitate. He knew that his previous conservative decision to give the crown prince time was the right one. Since the emperor had not died, the emperor should be the one to decide how to deal with the rebellious crown prince. Although he was a deposed crown prince who had rebelled, he was still the emperor's son. As the second prince's father-in-law, Yi Zhong did not want the crown prince to die in his hands. Fan Xian raised his eyes to look at the crown prince. The crown prince looked back at him. His pale lips trembled slightly. It was as if he had finally made an important decision. In a raspy voice, he slowly said, "You've come?" The rebel army threw down their weapons and surrendered. They became the prisoners of the Dingzhou army. A few of the Qin family generals were also captured and fell to the ground with faces of despair. The battle in Jingdou had temporarily come to an end. Yi Zhong led the army and escorted a black carriage toward the royal palace. The black carriage had been sent over as soon as possible by the Overwatch Council. There were two people sitting in the carriage. One was Fan Xian, and the other was the crown prince, Li Chengxian. The two brothers sat in the dark carriage. For a long time, neither of them spoke. There might be a problem with the third condition I promised you. Fan Xian's eyelids drooped slightly. In an apologetic tone, he said, "If I can't do it, don't blame me for lying to you." Crown Prince Li Chengxian did not want countless innocent rebel soldiers to lose their lives because of him. With great courage, he had surrendered. He had asked Fan Xian to come personally and agree to his 3 conditions before he was willing to surrender. Li Chengxian knew that in Jingdou, Fan Xian, who held his father's posthumous edict and had the support of the majority of people, had more power in his words than Yi Zhong, who had an army but was secretly cautious. As long as Fan Xian was willing to agree, no one in court would make things difficult for these common soldiers. Hearing Fan Xian's words, Crown Prince Chengxian thought Fan Xian was going back on his word. Staring into his eyes, he angrily said, "Why? I can fight for the lives of common soldiers, but I can't guarantee they will survive. Although they're just cannon fodder, this is rebellion. Although Qing law is not strict, it does not leave them a way out." The Crown Prince didn't understand the word cannon fodder, but he could guess what it meant. Fan Xian gazed at the Crown Prince's pale face and sighed. "As for the officials and generals who participated in the rebellion, I can't do anything about it. I know they won't survive, but I hope you won't implicate them. They're all large families. Once the killing starts, tens of thousands of people will probably die." Li Chengxian's expression was slightly dark. He hoped Fan Xian would make another promise. After all, Fan Xian had personally promised earlier in front of the 2 armies. Whether it's exterminating their families or implicating their 9 clans, this is not something I can control. Fan Xian's brows were furrowed tightly. A moment later, he said, "Just like I said earlier, I will do my best to do what I promised you. As for how many people I can save, I cannot guarantee." An image floated in front of Fan Xian's eyes. Countless heads were chopped off, countless children were thrown to their deaths, and countless officials' wives and young ladies were sent into the government workshops and barracks, never to rise again. Even though he was a cold-blooded person, once he thought of the tragedy that was about to befall Jingdou, he still felt a chill. Men rebelled for their own power, officials, and nobility. In the end, the ones to bear the tragic consequences were not only them, but also their wives, young and ignorant children, distant relatives from home, and friends from many years ago. Li Chengxian's entire body trembled. He grabbed Fan Xian's collar with one hand. A rare courage appeared on his pale and slightly fearful face. In a low voice, he roared, "If you hadn't promised me, how could I have surrendered? How could I have been willing to be your prisoner?" Fan Xian did not struggle free of the Crown Prince's powerless hands. Lowering his voice, he roared back, "Not surrendering? Do you really want to be killed in the chaos of the army?" Li Chengxian heard something else in Fan Xian's words. The hands gripping Fan Xian's collar unconsciously loosened. In a trembling voice, he said, "I, the Crown Prince, have already been deposed and am about to die. You are the regent, and the scholars all support you. Even if Ping ascends to the throne, you are still the emperor's tutor. You open your mouth and say one word. Who would dare to not listen to you?" The expression on Fan Xian's face was slightly indifferent. He opened his mouth and said, "The emperor is still alive." Li Chengxian abruptly heard this news. His arms hung weakly on his knees. Although he had already guessed this possibility when Yi Zhong first rebelled, once he actually heard the news, he still couldn't help but be shocked. "She is also dead," Fan Xian said quietly. Fan Xian quietly said these words, and then turned his face to look at the Crown Prince. He saw that Li Chengxian's face had become increasingly pale. His eyes stared woodenly and spiritlessly at the wall of the carriage. He couldn't speak for a long time. He gradually lowered his head and bent his body, burying his head. His shoulders trembled endlessly as he made a suppressed sound. Perhaps it was because he had been agitated by the Crown Prince's crying, but Fan Xian felt a wave of irritation in his chest. Unconsciously, he activated Tianyi Dao's Jinqi method to clear his meridians. Unexpectedly, when he reached the center of his chest, he felt a wave of pain for no reason. His vision darkened, and he could no longer control it. He spat out a mouthful of fresh blood onto the wall of the carriage with a splat. From Dong Mountain to Jingdou, he had been heavily injured and had traveled tens of thousands of li. Before he had time to recover, he had forcefully used medicine to suppress it. He had also experienced countless dangerous battles. Finally, he could not hold on any longer, and his injuries exploded out. The Crown Prince's emotions were completely wrapped up in the news of his father's survival and his aunt's death. He did not notice Fan Xian's situation at all. He buried his head in endless sorrow. Fan Xian wiped away the blood at the corner of his lips and took a few rough breaths. Glancing at the man beside him, he couldn't resist shaking his head. Li Changxian was about the same age as him. He didn't have two lives like Fan Xian, so he was just a young man. Just like this, one of the two brothers in the carriage vomited blood while the other cried. The black carriage entered the royal palace. Having finished bandaging his wounds, the great prince silently led the carriage directly to the back of the palace, the door to the eastern palace. Fan Xian and the crown prince got out of the carriage and walked in. This eastern palace had always been the residence of the successor to the throne. Now, it had truly become the crown prince's prison, or perhaps his future grave. The great prince and the crown prince quietly said something, glanced at Fan Xian, and then turned to leave. There was not a single person in the eastern palace. There were only the imperial soldiers patrolling outside. Fan Xian didn't have much time to say anything to the crown prince. Holding his chest, he straightforwardly said to him, "You only have one day." Li Changxian raised his head in shock. It was as if he had woken up from a nightmare. He stared at Fan Xian in a daze, not understanding what he was saying. The emperor should return to the capital the day after tomorrow. Fan Xian looked at him calmly. In the past, you once set fire to this eastern palace. I think it wouldn't be too surprising for the eastern palace to be burned again. Li Changxian's expression immediately changed. He stared into Fan Xian's eyes, as if trying to confirm what he was saying. His lips moved a few times, but no sound came out. Seeing that he didn't respond, Fan Xian lowered his head and darkly said, "Burning yourself to death is not difficult for you." Without waiting for him to finish speaking, Li Changxian had already coldly shook his head and said, "Then you will take advantage of the fire to rescue me from the royal palace and send me to a place no one knows about?" He looked at Fan Xian. His gaze was very complicated. "I don't know why you suddenly became such a gentle person, but I want to thank you." "There is no need to thank me," Fan Xian said. "However, the elders are used to arranging everything, but I'm not used to it." Li Changxian smiled with difficulty and said, "I truly can't see through you. You know I am a heartless person. It's rare for me to show kindness. The Empress is also dead. You should hate me. If you want to live, set a fire tonight," Fan Xian said. "It is not your style to take such a risk. My life has been gloomy for too long. I almost forgot that I once said I was going to live a full life. After experiencing so many things, only now do I understand that if I want to live brilliantly, I must first live with courage." Fan Xian didn't look at him anymore. He turned and left the silent palace. Li Changxian stared at his back in a daze. He didn't understand why he would suddenly be so kind. His brows gradually furrowed and became sorrowful. Letting out a long sigh, he lay down on the floor of the vast palace. An aloof smile rose to his face. His four limbs stretched out. It was as if he had never been so relaxed and free. That night, the eastern palace did not burn. Fan Xian remained in the direction of Hongguang Palace the entire time, coldly watching in that direction. Confirming the peace of the eastern palace, he shook his head and felt a slight desolation in his heart. The emperor would probably arrive in the capital the day after tomorrow. Everything would once again return to the hands of that powerful emperor. Leaving the crown prince alive was not Fan Xian's idea on the spur of the moment. It was also not because he was soft-hearted. Rather, it was because of a sense of sorrow that he and the crown prince, as well as the second prince, were merely chess pieces on the emperor's chessboard. They were puppets controlled by fate or the elders. The crown prince no longer had any power. His life or death did not matter to Fan Xian. The crown prince was a good person. This was something Fan Xian had once said to Qin Pingping a long time ago. From the first time they met on the road outside the palace, the impression the crown prince had left on Fan Xian was warm, particularly in the last 2 years. Although there had been endless fighting, so what? Fan Xian was able to send 13th Wang to protect the crown prince on his trip to Nanzhao. At this time, he dared to let the crown prince live. If Fan Xian wanted to break free of the threads behind him, and protect Li Chengqian's life, he would forcefully tear apart his stance for the first time. Presently, the entire royal palace was in his hands. Given the Overwatch Council's methods of disguising the scene and the Emperor's understanding of the Crown Prince's personality, it would not be difficult to use the excuse of self-immolation to hide it from the Emperor's eyes and ears without anyone knowing. However, the Crown Prince was like the eldest princess. His heart had long died. For someone whose heart had died, Fan Xian would not stupidly force himself to do anything. To be able to have such thoughts was enough to prove that after the spear in the meadow, his personality had changed a great deal. Night fell, and the palace lanterns were all extinguished. Outside the city, it was still not completely calm. Inside the royal palace, it was absolutely silent. The black sky enveloped the flat garden inside the palace. The imperial soldiers and Overwatch Council officials stationed everywhere stood motionless like statues. "Who is it?" Akasha's voice rang out inside Hongwang Palace. A serving girl lit the palace lantern. Seeing clearly the person in front of her, she quickly knelt down. Fan Xian waved his hand to indicate for her to rise. He ordered her to lead all of the serving girls and eunuchs out of Hongwang Palace. At this time, not many people knew that the emperor was already on his way back to the capital. As the regent and the third prince's teacher, Fan Xian was like a true emperor. The entire royal palace was unimpeded. No one dared to express doubt about his arrival. A dim lantern lit up. All of the serving girls and nannies retreated out of the palace in disheveled clothing. Fan Xian strolled alone through the vast palace and slowly walked to the phoenix bed. Looking at the old woman lying on the bed, he didn't wait for her hateful gaze to land on him. Fan Xian's right hand gently swiped and took out a thin needle that had not been dipped in poison. He pierced it into the old woman's neck. Looking at the unconscious Empress Dowager, Fan Xian crouched down and burrowed under the phoenix bed. Feeling for the secret compartment, his fingers pressed slightly and opened it. 3 years ago, he had once entered Hongwang Palace at night and used drugs to knock out the people inside. From this secret compartment, he had taken out the key to the chest and made a copy. At the time, there was also a white cloth and a letter in the secret compartment. Because of the urgency of time, he was unable to examine it closely. Today, there was a key and a white cloth in the secret compartment, but the letter was gone. Fan Xian held the white cloth in his hand and carefully stroked it. He sank into thought, but still couldn't find a clue. A moment later, he put the white cloth back into the secret compartment and carefully returned it to its original state. He then stood up and sat beside the Empress Dowager on the bed. He removed the thin needle from her neck. Once the Empress Dowager woke up, her eyes stared hatefully at Fan Xian as if she wanted to eat him. It had already been a day and night. She couldn't say a word or move. She felt that her life, which didn't have much to begin with, seemed to be endlessly flowing out of her body. The kind of terror and anger, yet unable to be vented, made her go crazy. "The Emperor is returning to the capital the day after tomorrow. I came to see grandmother." Fan Xian looked at her and said a moment later, "Are you very surprised? Only now do you know how big of a mistake you made a few days ago?" The Empress Dowager's eyes were filled with shock. If she had known earlier that the emperor was still alive, the situation in Jingdo would certainly not be like this. After the shock passed, a glimmer of joy appeared in her eyes. "Don't be happy too early." Fan Xian patted her wrinkled hand and said evenly, "I will let the emperor see you once, and then you will die. Believe me, even if the emperor is the most powerful person in the world, in terms of medical skills, he is not as good as me. If you don't believe me, you can try. You can already speak now. If you want to have a more dignified death and not like this, then please answer a few questions for me," Fan Xian said. "Who wrote that letter? What did it say? Also, what exactly is the connection between the Qin family and that matter 20 years ago?" Before the eldest princess died, she had told Fan Xian to ask Qin Pingping. He chose to simply and directly and crudely interrogate the Empress Dowager. "Don't think that I'm cold-blooded and shameless. Think about what you people did 20 years ago," Fan Xian said with his head lowered. "When you come out, you have to pay." As the Empress Dowager, I'm afraid you can't escape the cycle of heaven. Chapter 582. I recommend Rice Cake's new book to everyone. Please support it. Title: Ambitious Sky Demon Book Number 1042406. The author's own YY introduction. The legend of the most powerful demon. Human beauties, demon saintesses, all stand still and don't move. Lie down obediently. P.S. Today's chapter is talking about how old Ginger doesn't die. It's just gradually fading. The despairing Empress Dowager didn't say the answer Fanxian wanted to know. Her lips trembled as she closed her eyes with difficulty. Fanxian looked at the wrinkles on her face. There were not many strange emotions in his heart. He had long guessed this result. However, to be able to have such a conversation with this seemingly benevolent but actually ruthless old woman in the middle of the night was a kind of spiritual comfort for him, particularly at a time when the emperor was about to return to the capital. In reality, the Empress Dowager of the Qin Kingdom could not be considered to have a heart as evil as a scorpion. In these decades, she had not used the emperor's filial piety and power in her hands to harm too many people or do too many evil things, other than the matter with Yi Qingmei. For some reason, for Fanxian, this old woman's connection to that matter 20 years ago was even harder to tolerate than trying to kill him. Furthermore, this old woman had always hated him. It was not until after the Hanging Temple incident and the emperor acknowledged Fanxian's identity that she pretended to pray in the memorial hall and gave him a string of prayer beads to express her attitude. For people he admired and people who could not threaten him, Fanxian could show his generosity and grace. However, for the Empress Dowager who had the power to threaten him, he did not admire her. He would also not show the filial piety and gentleness of a grandson. After the emperor returned to the capital and learned of everything that had happened in Jingdo, regardless of whether or not he could understand Fanxian's forced entry into the royal palace at night and his helplessness in pointing his sword at the Empress Dowager, Fanxian would not leave himself too many fatal openings. He slowly used his hands to massage the Empress Dowager's arm and sent Jinshi into her body, helping the slow release of the medicinal properties of the pill in her body gradually speed up, allowing her threads of life to gradually dissipate. After carefully doing all of this, the Empress Dowager once again became a person who could not speak or move. Even her gaze became dim and vacant, like the dementia of an old person before death. From a clean and efficient point of view, Fanxian should have had the Empress Dowager die naturally before the emperor returned to the capital. However, he did not dare take this risk and gamble on the emperor's heart. If the Empress Dowager could live until the emperor returned to the capital, then Fanxian would not have to be responsible for her death. If the Empress Dowager died during the few days Fanxian was supervising the country, he would probably have to face the emperor's unreasonable anger. He purposely raised his voice to say a few comforting words to express his filial piety and slight apologies. After waiting for a while, Fanxian walked out of Hongguang Palace and nodded slightly to the serving girls and housemaids in the front hall. Under the respectful gazes of the crowd, he walked to the stone steps in front of the palace and glanced at the eastern palace in the distance. He didn't see any fire and didn't do anything else. At the brightly lit doors of the royal palace, Fanxian saw King Jing hurrying over. This king was finally no longer dressed as a gardener. Instead, he was properly wearing a king's clothing. King Jing's manor and the Fan manor had always been on good terms. During the turmoil in Jingdo, they had relied on King Jing's identity to successfully hide their father in the manor. Fanxian felt gratitude toward this king and quickly went forward to greet him with a deep bow. He knew the reason why this king, who had always refused to enter the palace, had hurried over tonight. The news in the palace had already been released. All of the officials and people in Jingdo knew that the Empress Dowager's anxiety had attacked her heart because of the crown prince and eldest princess's rebellion. Additionally, the royal palace had been surrounded and she had been frightened. She had also caught a cold and was bedridden. She probably didn't have many days left to live. Although King Jing often pretended to be a gardener and was unwilling to be close to his mother, he was, after all, the Empress Dowager's own son. Hearing this news, he rushed to enter the palace. He looked at the handsome junior in front of him and couldn't help but sigh. He glanced at Fanxian but didn't say anything. Fanxian's expression was calm. He had already clearly told King Jing that the Empress Dowager didn't have many days left. Although everyone knew that the Empress Dowager's anxiety had little to do with the Crown Prince, he was not worried that King Jing would see what he had done to the Empress Dowager. Some indirect news had confirmed that King Jing also knew martial arts. If he couldn't even hide it from King Jing tonight, how could the Emperor, who was about to return to the capital? Brother is still alive? King Jing asked after he finished sighing. Fanxian nodded. At Taiping Courtyard, I saw the Emperor's letter to the eldest princess. The expression on King Jing's face was complicated. As a second-generation disciple of the royal family, he had never participated in any political affairs, but he knew how far the Jingdo rebellion implicated. The news that the Emperor was still alive allowed him to clearly guess part of the truth. He said with slight mockery, "Brother, you are very broad-minded and have very powerful methods." King Jing immediately thought of someone and furrowed his brows slightly. "How is she?" Fanxian knew who he was asking about. With a serious expression, he replied, "She has already passed away. She is now in the manor. I don't know what to do with her." "Please, your highness." King Jing's expression was slightly sorrowful. He cut him off and said weakly, "You are now the regent. Everything is up to you." Worried about his mother's illness, he didn't say much to Fanxian. He only briefed him on Minister Fan's situation. Then, led by a few eunuchs, he hurried in the direction of Hongguang Palace. Fanxian learned from the king that his father had safely returned to the manor. His heart calmed slightly. Shortly after, he remembered that there was still a large pile of troublesome matters to take care of in the manor. He couldn't help but furrow his brows. Too many officials had died, and the emperor had not returned. Jingdo was in chaos. No officials from the various yamens had returned, and there was no trace of anyone from Taichung Temple. The eldest princess's follow-up could only be resolved later. After Yi Zhong resolved the crown prince's problem, he personally led an army out of the capital. He met up with the follow-up troops from Dingzhou on the plains and began to chase after the remnants of the rebel army. The great prince personally led the imperial army to guard the royal palace and could not easily leave. The scholars Shu and who were in the royal study dealing with some urgent documents. Fanxian looked around. Although he was the temporary regent, he had become a loner. Without people in his hands, he couldn't do anything. Fortunately, after Sun Jingxiu of the Jingdo government surrendered, he resolutely carried out his duty. With the help of the Overwatch Council, he was working hard to maintain Jingdo's peace and order. During the day, the fleeing commoners had already left the city through Zhengyang Gate, controlled by Gong Dian. The remaining commoners in Jingdo began to wait bitterly for peace. Silence returned to Jingdo in the middle of the night. The fires that had been lit everywhere during the day were gradually extinguished. There were only a few places that still flashed with the light of fire. Fanxian stood on the square in front of the palace gates and looked at the broken stone marks on the tiles, as well as the traces of fresh blood that had not yet been washed away. He paused slightly. Jing Ji's group of Black Knights, as well as the Overwatch Council secret agents who had carried out the ambush outside Jingyang Gate, had suffered heavy casualties. Those who had luckily survived had already been sent to the Overwatch Council's square building for treatment. He trusted in the medical skills of his brothers in the Third Bureau. The Imperial Academy of Medicine was also temporarily conscripted into private residences to bandage up the injured Imperial soldiers and Dingzhou soldiers. However, many people still died. In the far northeast corner, there were soldiers silently moving bodies. In the darkness, they piled up into a small mountain. It looked incomparably sinister. At this time, there was no time to move these bodies out of the city for burial. Fanxian looked at this scene and took out a medicinal pill from his clothes. He didn't drink any water. He chewed it in 2 mouthfuls and swallowed it. It was not an ephedra pill. It was a normal healing medicine. He coughed and used his sleeve to wipe away the threads of blood at the side of his lips. He couldn't resist shaking his head. This was the first time he had experienced a true battle. Looking at scene after scene of tragic and heroic scenes happening in front of his eyes, He finally understood that digging graves and admiring corpses when he was young could not train his nerves to the point of being too emotionless. In the depths of his heart, he once again said to himself, "In this world, there is no good war or bad peace." He had to carry out the agreement he made with Haitang in the 5th year of the Qing calendar, even if he had to face a powerful enemy he had never encountered before. Qingyu Hall should have already been burned to ruins, Fan Xian thought to himself. In order to not raise suspicions afterward, the surrounding private residences would also suffer. After the chaos, who knew how many private residences in Jingdo would be burned and looted? Presumably, it wouldn't draw too much attention. At this moment, a rider galloped in from the northwest, startling the night that had just quieted. The people on and off the royal palace all tensed up. The exhausted imperial soldiers struggled to raise the weapons in their hands until they noticed that the newcomer was wearing the robes of the Overwatch Council. Fan Xian's eyes narrowed as he looked at the subordinate galloping in front of him. He didn't say anything, but his gaze already carried a heavy, questioning meaning. The newcomer was a member of the Qinian unit. Wang Qinian had single-handedly chosen him. His loyalty to him was without question. Thus, he had arranged for this person to secretly watch Teng Zijing's movements to prevent the old shopkeepers of Qingyu Hall from encountering any danger when they left the capital. It was clear that something had gone wrong for this subordinate to gallop in front of him. The Overwatch Council official looked into Fan Xian's eyes and reported in a low voice, "Something unexpected has happened." There were no unrelated people around, so Fan Xian said straightforwardly, "Speak." The official looked around and said carefully, "The ignition went smoothly, and there was no problem in mixing in with the fleeing crowd and getting out of the city. However, the brothers who stayed here realized that they had alerted the spies here, but we don't know who they are." Who were they? Of course, Fan Xian knew. It had to be the spies the emperor had left behind. The things in the old shopkeepers' heads were too precious. There had to be a group of people in the palace responsible for monitoring them. Even if there was a rebellion in Jingdo, these people would still be lying in ambush. "I don't have many people on me." Fan Xian stared at him and said in a cold voice. Fan Xian stared at him and said in a cold voice, "I only gave you 20, yet you still can't solve these problems." The official lowered his head and didn't dare make any excuses. The other party's background is strong. 3 of them got away. Fan Xian no longer scolded the official because he didn't dare let too many people know about this matter. So, he carried it out very discreetly. Accurately speaking, he was taking a big risk. There were many loopholes in the original plan, so the execution was not smooth. The official raised his head and glanced at him. Using a complicated emotion, he said, 3 got away. We later chased after them and found a dozen dead bodies, and 1 person left a message for you." This sentence was difficult to understand. It didn't make any sense logically. 3 spies from the palace had gotten away. So how could they have found a dozen dead bodies? Fan Xian's heart thumped. What message? That person said there was someone waiting at home. There was someone waiting for him at home. So Fan Xian rushed home at the first opportunity. It was the 2nd time he had entered the manor today. He ran directly to his father's study in the back garden. The unlit fan manor was still as beautiful as ever. The light in the study shone through the glass and onto the fake mountains and clear water. Just as King Jing had said, his father had already returned home safely. Fan Xian let out a secret sigh of relief. Without waiting for a report, he pushed open the door and entered. He saw Lady Lu packing something. Fan Xian looked around and knew that his father had finished drinking the sour berries. In a time like this, his father still had the leisure to drink sour berries. Fan Xian couldn't help but feel admiration for his determination. "Mother, are you well?" He respectfully bowed to Lady Lu. Lady Lu was now the official mistress of Fan Manor. Of course, this was because of his efforts when he first got married. Lady Lu smiled and said that she was going to comfort her daughter-in-law. She then left the study. Sitting in the armchair, the Minister of Revenue, Fan Jian, raised his head and glanced at his son. Relief and a glimmer of reproach flowed through his eyes. Ever since the incident in Jingdo, This figure of the older generation, who had been hiding everywhere in Jingdo, finally stopped hiding his thoughts. The spies outside of Qingyu Hall were killed by someone I sent. Fan Jian gently tapped on the desk. He seemed to be deep in thought. Evenly, he said, I don't know why you became so radical. You actually dared to carry out such a flawed plan? Did you really think the Emperor couldn't see through it? Fan Xian smiled bitterly. His mentality had indeed undergone a great change. However, such a thing as courage often meant a flaw. He sat down and respectfully said, Thank you, father. He knew that his father was secretly training the Tiger Guards for the royal family. It would not make sense if his father didn't have some hidden power. It was not surprising that his father had sent people to kill the spies of the internal court. Furthermore, since he had told Yi Zhong the shocking news of the Emperor's survival, his father also knew about it. Killing is easy. The explanation afterward is what is complicated, Minister Fan said thoughtfully. Even if Jingdo is in chaos and the army is killing, have you ever thought that the old shopkeepers of Qingyu Hall would coincidentally all be burned to death in the fire? You placed 12 bodies in the fire. That was just deceiving yourself. Fan Xian listened quietly to his teachings. And those spies of the internal court, even if you use the power of the Overwatch Council to kill them all, how can you guarantee that your subordinates didn't have the Emperor's spies? They acted separately. Other than the Qinian unit, no one else knew the inside story, Fan Xian explained. All right, even if the Overwatch Council has been turned into a metal plate by Chun Pingping, let me ask you after this, who will explain to the Emperor why all the spies of the internal court watching Qingyu Hall died without a single one left? Fan Xian was speechless. Only now did he understand that even if they killed people to silence them, the deaths of the spies of the internal court, who should not have died at the hands of the chaotic army, would still arouse the Emperor's suspicions. Furthermore, these old shopkeepers still have family in Jingdo. Fan Jian looked at his son and said evenly, Do they really want to leave? Do they dare to leave? I only had Teng Zijing send the 4 old shopkeepers away. Qingyu Hall must have people alive for it to conform to common sense. Do you understand? I understand. A layer of cold sweat appeared on Fan Xian's forehead. As for fighting with the spies of the internal court and having designs on the old shopkeepers of Qingyu Hall, it is not you or me. It is the eldest princess. Fan Jian's gaze became cold. Those 12 bodies were Xinyang's suicide soldiers. Since we want to convince the Emperor, we have to make him believe it. The person who acted had this need. The eldest princess knows the importance of the palace treasury. Of course, she'll want to fight for Qingyu Hall. Only she has this ability and this thought. Fan Xian was completely convinced. Minister Fan suddenly sighed and said, NG, I don't know what you were thinking or why you're doing this, but you have to remember, in the end, you are a person of the Qin Kingdom. I am also a person of the Qin Kingdom. No matter what, don't do anything that will harm the foundation of the Qin Kingdom. Fan Xian's heart jumped. He knew his father had seen through his plans at a glance. He wanted to defend himself, but he couldn't bear to lie and deceive his father. He could only helplessly remain silent. Fan Jian looked at his son and sighed again. Shaking his head, he said, I won't scold you. In the end, this palace treasury is your mother's. Although as an official of the Qin Kingdom, I don't want to see certain things happen. You can do whatever you want. Fan Xian's entire body shook. He hadn't thought his father would make such a decision. His father would not lie to him or harm him. He knew the importance of the palace treasury to the Qin Kingdom's unification of the world. So why would he still help him? I'm already old, and I don't have much power. Perhaps Minister Fan knew something. A glimmer of tiredness and age appeared on his usually stern and handsome face. Slowly, he said, After the Emperor returns to the capital, I will ask for my resignation. I will help you as much as I can in Jingdo. I can't just watch as something happens to you. Chapter 583. Why? Faced with his son's shocked questioning, Minister Fan did not continue this topic. He smiled and changed the topic. Is the situation in the palace still well? Fan Xian replied after a pause. The great prince is on duty with an injury. The Empress Dowager is seriously ill, and the crown prince has already been locked up in the Eastern Palace. There shouldn't be any problems. Fan Jian nodded. A glimmer of softness gradually appeared in his eyes as he looked at him. He sighed with admiration and said, "You've only been back in the capital for 7 or 8 days. To be able to protect Jingdo for the emperor under such difficult and dangerous circumstances, it has to be said that your improvement has already surpassed my expectations. You have performed very well." Receiving his father's praise, Fan Xian did not feel any joy in his heart. He smiled bitterly and said, "The great prince and I fought to the death in Jingdo. Who would have thought that the emperor had calculated everything? If it wasn't for the Dingzhou army's final betrayal, we would not have been able to hold the royal palace today, no matter what." Without waiting for him to finish, Fan Jian waved his hand and stopped him. "The emperor plans deeply and thinks far ahead. His sacred heart is vast. He is not someone that we, as officials, can vainly speculate about." His tone revealed a glimmer of unnaturalness. He continued to speak and sighed. "The problem with the Yi family has truly exceeded everyone's expectations. A few years of coercion was actually the emperor's hidden pawn." He looked at Fan Xian and revealed a slightly scholarly smile. "From this, it looks like after the attack in the valley in Jingdo a year and a half ago, the judgment was correct. I was wrong." Fan Xian was silent. After the attack in the valley last year, he and his father had once studied the problem of the city guarding crossbows. Later, although they knew it was the old Qin family's doing, they had wondered if the emperor would take his anger out on Yizhong. From this, they talked about the Qin kingdom's various military divisions. Surprisingly, during these 20 years, other than Yizhong, who had always been the commander of the Jingdo garrison, the commander of the royal palace's imperial army, and the head of the internal guards were both under one person. At the time, Fan Xian had suspected this. Since the emperor had once trusted the Yi family so much, why did he force the Yi family to ally with the second prince and lean toward the eldest princess's side? However, Fan Jian had given what he thought was the reason. Fan Xian thought it was reasonable, so he let go of this question. Unexpectedly, in the Jingdo chaos, this question finally revealed the truth of the emperor's hidden and suspicious weakness. The emperor had constructed a huge mystery. Not only had he fooled the eldest princess and everyone else in the world, he had even fooled Fan Jian, a trusted aide who had grown up with him since childhood. Speaking of the attack in the valley, the white snow, red blood, and heads in front of the Bureau of Military Affairs involuntarily rose in front of Fan Xian's eyes, as well as his own arrogance. He couldn't help but laugh bitterly. In front of the emperor and eldest princess, his arrogance back then seemed childish and laughable. His heart, he asked, "Father, why Emperor Qin?" This was not only his question, it was also the question of many people. However, in the struggle for imperial power and the struggle for the power of the world, everyone naturally thought that the Qin family's betrayal was like every other internal strife in the history books. It was a matter of course. However, Fan Xian heard the eldest princess's words before she died. A poisonous flower bloomed in his heart. He began to pay particular attention to this question. Although the Qin family had a 10% share in the Ming family, and the Qin family had secretly ordered the Jiaozhou Navy to massacre the island, for an elder of the military, just his face was enough for the emperor to easily let this matter go, as long as he remained loyal to the emperor. What kind of person was the emperor? If he had not never doubted Qin Ye's loyalty, how could he have allowed him to stay in the position of the Bureau of Military Affairs for so many years? These years, the old Qin master had always said he was ill and did not go to court. The position of the head of the Bureau of Military Affairs had never been empty. After he spoke of this question, Fan Jian did not think deeply about it. He directly and coldly said, "It was also on the day of the attack in the valley that I once said the Empress's father's head was cut off by me. Who knows if the heads that should have been cut off were actually all cut off?" Fan Xian's heart trembled. He understood his father's meaning. The old Qin family, standing on the eldest princess's side in rebellion, perhaps had something to do with his mother's strange death 20 years ago. Back then, when I followed the emperor to Shihu to fight, Chun Pingping was moved to the Yanjing area to deal with the emergency situation in the north, and Yi Zhong was stationed in Dingzhou to hold the line for the emperor. Fan Jian lowered his eyes and slowly said, "At that time, Qin Yi was following the court's old practice. As the head of the Bureau of Military Affairs, he controlled the center of Jingdou's military power. If he was also involved in the Jingdou rebellion, no one would find it strange. It was very strange. If the old Qin master was also one of the main culprits behind Yi Qingmei's murder, then why was the Qin family not implicated in the night of Jingdou's bloodshed 4 years later, when the empress's clan was completely slaughtered and Jingdou's nobility was massacred? If the emperor, Chun Pingping, and his father had joined hands to avenge his mother, how could they have let the old Qin master go?" Meeting Fan Xian's questioning gaze, Fan Jian slowly said, "The problem is there has never been proof that the Qin family was involved in this matter. Just like the Empress Dowager, at most, they are guilty of conniving." Fan Xian furrowed his brows slightly. Chun Pingping had once said this to him. Concerning his mother's death, the Empress Dowager should not be the main culprit. She could only be guilty of conniving. After discussing it with his father, Fan Xian suddenly thought that Director Chen probably had other thoughts in his heart. He had boundless suspicions about the role the Qin family had once played. The person who could best prove Chun Pingping's intentions toward the Qin family was the deputy commander of the Black Knights, Jing Ge. Why did Chun Pingping still secretly take such a dangerous figure who wanted to destroy the entire Qin family? Was it to make a move against the Qin family in the future? A chill rose in Fan Xian's heart. If the Qin family was truly, as Chun Pingping suspected, involved in Yi Qingmei's murder, why was he still alive? Thinking of this, a cold current began to surge out from within his body. Countless coldness seeped out from his pores, making the study become as cold as winter. He had guessed countless times and was infinitely close to the truth. However, he didn't dare ask. Even Chun Pingping didn't dare ask. Furthermore, Chun Pingping had heartlessly separated himself from him and didn't give him any chance to open his mouth. There had always been a knot in Fan Xian's heart. Thus, he had always quietly shifted his focus toward northern Qi. He had a natural fear toward the Qin kingdom. Now, this knot seemed to be unraveling and revealing the dark truth within. Thus, he was silent. He smiled slightly at his father and said, "If the Qin family was truly involved in this matter, it could be considered retribution." He was worried that his father would follow this train of thought and think of the things he feared earlier, so he rushed to say, "The emperor will return to the capital in a few days." Earlier, the court was still preparing for the emperor's funeral. "I don't know how it will turn around." Fan Jian smiled and said, "Naturally, the Ministry of Rights will worry about these things. Why do you need to care so much?" Fan Xian shrugged and didn't say anything more. Minister Fan also fell silent. A glimmer of confusion appeared on his face. The atmosphere in the study was somewhat strange. Presumably, the surviving nobles and officials in Jingdou were all silent in their own residences. No one had thought that the emperor would be able to come down from Dong Mountain alive. Amidst their shock, they thought of the Yi family's ambush in the rebellion and the many watertight calculations. All of the officials' respect and fear of the emperor had been raised to an unprecedented level. Fan Xian looked at his silent father and rose to say a few more words. He then turned and left. Walking out of the study, he headed toward the back garden behind the street to see Wan. Along the way, the night wind was as cool as water and blew against his face. He couldn't help but feel a wave of pleasure. He took a deep breath and maintained the injuries in his body. He thought blankly that Chun Pingping's letting go during the attack in the valley was a kind of separation. The old cripple lived up to his reputation as the most powerful person in the world. He had long seen through everything, yet he carefully hid the truth from Fan Xian and did those things alone. He also used these separations to maintain his safety afterward. Fan Xian had been learning from Chun Pingping, so he could only be silent tonight. His father was about to resign and return home. Why should he let his own guesses sink him into Jingdou's dangerous situation and be unable to free himself? For the sake of each other's safety, they had to separate each other. This was true love. just like how Chen Pingping loved him. At this time, Fan Xian very much wanted to see Chen Pingping. Chen Pingping was leisurely traveling around Jingdou. Occasionally, he would give orders for the Overwatch Council to cooperate with the Emperor's actions under heaven. Even if he wanted to return to Jingdou before the Emperor arrived in the capital, it could not be tonight. However, someone had come to the Fan Manor to find Fan Xian. It was already late at night. Before Fan Xian could see his wife, he was helplessly asked to leave the manor. He looked at Gong Jian at the door and took a deep breath. Pushing down the threads of irritation in his heart, he bowed and said, "Sir Gong." Earlier, he and his father had been discussing this person in the study. He knew that he was one of the Emperor's most trusted people, so he spoke with propriety. In Gong Dian's view, Sir Fan Jr. was the Emperor's closest nephew. He did not dare to be arrogant. Bowing as a subordinate, he said in a low voice, "There is something I must trouble the Duke of Donbo with." Fan Xian was now a duke, so he was worthy of this bow. Furthermore, in the few days before the Emperor returned to the capital, he was still a regent. Hearing the word trouble, Fan Xian knew it was going to be big trouble. He couldn't help but feel a real headache coming on. Too many people had died in Jingdou, so Fan Xian's mood was not very good. Battles were still raging around Jingdou, but the inside of the city had gradually calmed down. He desperately needed to rest and think. Being disturbed by someone, he did not have a good expression. However, was it so easy to be regent? Fan Xian forcefully pushed down the irritation in his heart and looked at him. Doing his best to calm down, he said, "What is it?" Gong Jian looked at him with some hesitation and difficulty. Even during the day, when he had attacked the military elder, the old Qin master, amidst tens of thousands of rebel soldiers, it had not been this difficult. Fan Xian didn't speak. He only looked at him calmly. Perhaps the pressure was too great. Gong Jian swallowed and said, "Please go to the manor. I can't persuade the young mistress." Fan Xian immediately understood what had happened. During the day, he had been busy killing people and saving people. He had not thought of this at all. Now, in the dead of night, the smoke of battle had dissipated slightly. He immediately thought of the big trouble the Yi family was about to encounter after they had followed the Emperor and made great contributions. The commander left the capital in pursuit and ordered me to bring the young mistress back to the manor. Unexpectedly, the young mistress refused to obey. Gong Dian had stood guard at Zhengyang Gate for a long time at night. He knew that in Jingdou, probably only Fan Xian could handle this matter and had the right to handle royal matters. Thus, he no longer cared about Ding Zhou's face and spoke of the problem straightforwardly. Fan Xian continued to look at Gong Dian calmly and allowed him to speak. There was no disdain or mockery in his eyes. However, it made Gong Jian feel an inexplicable sense of unease and shame. Fan Xian took a deep breath and didn't say anything. In this entire matter, of the people still alive, the ones who suffered the most were probably one and her close friend, Yiling. His wife was heartbroken over the death of her mother. Yiling grievance and anger would probably not be any less. When Yiling married the second prince, it could be said that they were congenial. However, no one would have guessed that this marriage was only a part of the plan between the emperor and Yi Zhong. In other words, Yiling couldn't even be considered a pawn. She had only given up her feelings and marriage to become a bargaining chip for the Yi family to win the eldest princess' trust. Only when things came to a head did she suddenly realize that her father had wholeheartedly wanted to defeat her husband. Of course, her husband had wholeheartedly wanted to use her to control the Dingzhou army. Thinking of this, Fan Xian couldn't help but think of the words the eldest princess had said before she died. The men of the world were all controlled by fame, power, and the so-called ideal of uniting the world. They truly were not good people. Perhaps that included himself. But he asked himself if he could do such a thing. He felt endless loathing for Yi Zhong, who had sold his daughter. Gong Dian seemed to guess what he was thinking. His expression was very unnatural. Fan Xian shook his head and said, "Is the second prince also locked up in the manor?" Gong Dian made a noise of acknowledgement. Fan Xian lowered his head and said, "It's fine." On Dong Mountain, The emperor once said not to kill if possible, particularly Chengze. Gong Dian raised his head in shock. He knew of the news of the emperor's survival, but this was the first time he had heard that the emperor had personally given such an order to Fan Xian. If the emperor was truly willing to leave the second prince with his life, it would be a great blessing. Everyone in Dingzhou actually liked Yiling. Now that the truth had been revealed and Yiling was mourning in the manor, all of the Dingzhou soldiers felt incomparable shame and unease. Hearing that the second prince did not need to die, Yiling did not need to be a widow, which made it easier to explain. Fan Xian sighed in his heart, thinking of the emperor's orders on Dong Mountain. Only now did he understand that the emperor had already confidently calculated that he would return to the capital safely and that the eldest princess would lead the crown prince and second prince in defeat. Thus, he had purposely reminded him to leave the second prince with his life. Leaving the second prince with his life was actually leaving Yiling, a man, and a sliver of face for the Yi family, who had performed meritorious service. Otherwise, if the second prince suddenly died, what would Yiling do? With the endless discussion under heaven, how would the Yi family live? Although the emperor had long calculated, Fan Xian still went to the manor. Even if he did not have any good feelings toward the second prince, Yiling had, after all, called him teacher countless times. Furthermore, as the regent, he had to handle the captured prince carefully. If something truly happened in the manor, it would be difficult for him to explain. He didn't raise his head to look at the signboard on the manor. Accompanied by Gong Dian, he walked straight in. There were soldiers watching all around. Even if the second prince still had strength in his hands, it would be difficult for him to transform into a mosquito and fly out of this cage. This was the first time Fan Xian had stepped into the second prince's manor. He couldn't help but feel strange. He didn't know what this brother, whose temperament, appearance, and temperament were similar to his, was thinking. Gong Dian stayed outside the rear courtyard while Fan Xian went in alone. The garden was quiet and secluded, completely unlike the grand scene a manor should have. There were still lights in the room. It looked like although it was late at night, the young prince and Wang Fei still could not sleep. Entering the door, he saw Yiling alone. Her face was full of sorrow as she sat silently by the table. She didn't say a word. There were still traces of tears at the corners of her eyes. Her usually bright, jade-like eyes now had an indescribable tiredness and grievance, as well as a hidden anger. Wang Fei was like a tiger that could pounce at any moment and bite someone to death. Putting aside the fact that she had been used by her husband, she had been deceived by her father, and she had been thrown out by her family. How could she bear it? A faint sense of pity rose in Fan Xian's heart. He walked to her side and said in an even voice, "Gong Dian had good intentions in having you return to the manor. After the matter fades in a few days, won't you and Chengze still be together?" Yiling was startled. Only now did she realize that it was him who had entered the room. The mockery in her eyes grew. She wanted to mock him, but her heart ached. She lowered her head and began to cry silently. Fan Xian had never seen Yiling so graceful and sorrowful. For a moment, he didn't know how to comfort her. A moment later, Yiling raised her head and looked at him with lifeless eyes. "You're not in the palace doing your job as regent. What are you doing in the manor?" "I'm trying to persuade you," Fan Xian replied straightforwardly. Yiling slowly shook her head. "Don't be stubborn. Your father can't do anything about this matter. After all is said and done, if the second prince had listened to your advice and not participated in this matter, there would not be today's situation." Looking at Yiling's sorrowful appearance, Fan Xian became angry for no reason. These years, he had used all his strength to attack the second prince. Hidden in his subconscious was an idea to use the Overwatch Council and the Emperor's trusted aides to cripple the second prince's power and cut off his thoughts of fighting for the throne. Unexpectedly, the second prince's desire for power was so strong. Additionally, with the eldest princess's clever teasing, this plan did not have the slightest effect. Yiling smiled sorrowfully and quietly said, "Teacher, I don't blame you for this matter. How he ends up is his own business. These years, even you can't beat back his burning desire. How can I, a woman, persuade him? You don't need to persuade me to leave the manor. He is involved in rebellion. Who would give him a way out? Yiling-er's expression gradually calmed. No matter what kind of person Xingze is, he and I are, in the end, husband and wife. Since father and the people of the clan have never seen me as a person, it is good that I go with him. We can be husband and wife in the underworld. I think that in that lonely place, he won't still have his beautiful dreams of being an emperor. Fanxian's heart froze. He could clearly see a glimmer of a will to die in Yiling-er's calm expression. In a trembling voice, he said, I'll tell you frankly, the emperor personally gave me an edict on Dong Mountain. Xingze will not die. Hearing these words, Yiling abruptly raised her head. A glimmer of hope and unexpected joy flashed through her eyes. Immediately after, it dimmed, making Fanxian a bit confused. Yiling-er shook her head and sighed quietly. Everyone says that he appears gentle on the outside, but is cold and heartless on the inside. Actually, these words are not wrong. Even his mother in the palace is polite to him. In his life, when has he ever felt any true warmth? Not only is he heartless to others, he is also very cold to himself. I am his wife. I understand him better than you outsiders. You don't know what kind of proud and conceited person he is in his heart. The complete failure this time was a great blow to him. Even if father left him a way out, how could he have the face to continue living? She raised her head and looked at Fanxian with a helpless and hurt gaze. After returning to the manor, he still refused to say a word. I know that he already has thoughts of dying. If even I leave at this time and everyone in the world abandons him, his departure will certainly be very straightforward. Fanxian took a deep breath and straightforwardly said, Where is he? The second prince, Li Chengze, was squatting on a chair with a bunch of purple grapes in his hand. He was bringing them to his lips. Fanxian had seen this scene countless times. Tonight, the second prince's hair was disheveled. There was an unreadable expression on his handsome face. The corners of his lips were slightly tilted as if he was laughing at something. His entire person appeared unusually dispirited. If you die, who will take care of Lady Shu? What about Wang Fei? Fanxian sat across from him and spoke as calmly as he could. His eyes were level with the other person. It was as if he was looking at another version of himself. Fanxian's temperament was very similar to the second prince's. This was news that had long spread through Jingdou. The two of them clearly did not look alike, but sitting across from each other, it was as if they were looking at themselves through a layer of mirrors. Fanxian looked at the other person and thought to himself that if his mother was not Yi Qingmei and his identity was switched with the second prince, he would probably only be able to sit on a chair and eat grapes without spitting out the skin. The second prince seemed to have only just noticed Fanxian's arrival. He smiled slightly and said, Can I still survive? Fanxian had no choice but to repeat the emperor's edict. The second prince smiled self-mockingly and said, To live like a yellow dog and be imprisoned in the manor for the rest of my life. When father's 100 years are almost up and before the new emperor ascends the throne, the Yi family will be slaughtered like a dog, and then I will be ordered to die. Tell me, if I survive, will my future life be like this? Fanxian was silent. Since it is so, why should I burden burden that shameless father-in-law? The second prince shrugged his shoulders. Furthermore, there is actually no meaning in continuing to live like this. Fanxian opened his mouth and said, Looks like your ambition has finally been extinguished. The second prince suddenly stopped moving the grapes into his mouth. The purple grapes of early autumn were sweet and juicy. The smile on his face was also very sweet. He looked at Fanxian and faintly said, Now that I think about it, in the tea shop in front of Baiwa Brothel, what you said was correct. During these 2 years, you have always wanted to extinguish my ambition. Thinking back, I must thank you. Speaking of which, it is strange. I wholeheartedly thought that my aunt would help me, wholeheartedly thought that my father-in-law would help me. Looking back and forth, it was you, the greatest enemy of my life, who once had a glimmer of sincerity toward me. The second prince sighed in admiration. "You are truly an anomaly in the Li family. The young lady of the Yi family is indeed as unusual as the rumors say. And me?" The second prince continued to speak and laughed loudly. He laughed until tears and snot streamed down his face. "What am I? I thought that I schemed against others, that I had countless supporters behind me, and that the throne was just around the corner. Who would have thought that everything was arranged by Father? And I, a clever person, was not even as good as a chess piece. I was not even as good as Changqian, that coward. I could do nothing. I had no ideas. I was like a powerless child. I could only watch stupidly as all of this happened." The second prince was angry. His voice grew louder and louder. He didn't know what he was angry about, but it was clearly not directed at Fan Xian. Perhaps he was angry that he had been placed in the position of a whetstone by Father since he was young and was forced to walk step by step to where he was today. Perhaps he was angry at Yi Zhong's heartless betrayal. Perhaps he was angry that he was born in the royal palace. Fan Xian was silent. He had learned from that this second brother, who had a good relationship with her since childhood, was nicknamed Stone. Even if he was a simple and stubborn stone, after being sharpened by the emperor with the sword of imperial power for so many years, for no reason, he would still carry some viciousness and negativity. "What am I?" The second prince Li Qingzi stared at Fan Xian and pointed at himself. Tears and snot streamed down his face. He laughed loudly and said, "I am a joke." Fan Xian wanted to say that in front of the emperor, it seemed that everyone in the world was a joke. However, he didn't say these words because he watched in shock as the laughing and crying second prince spat out a mouthful of black blood after saying the word joke. A mouthful of black blood landed on the purple grapes. Chapter 584. Black blood sprayed onto the purple grapes and dripped down to the ground, wetting the floor illuminated by the lantern light. The second prince lowered his head and opened his mouth. There was a patch of blood on his lower jaw. His eyes were lowered. Without looking at Fan Xian, he raised his hand and stopped him from walking over. "The moment you entered the manor, I took the medicine." The second prince crouched on the chair with his head very low. Faintly, he said, "I know you are Fei Jie's student, but the poison has already entered my heart. You can't save me. I also don't want you to save me. You have to know that although you are powerful, you can't stop me from dying. As long as a person had the will to die, no matter what method was used, it was impossible to save his life." Fan Xian understood this. He looked at the other person calmly. His heart was empty and had no thoughts. However, he was still not prepared to watch with folded arms. It was not because he had a glimmer of brotherly affection for the second prince. Rather, he could not let the other person die in front of him. "Don't worry about anything. I have already written my will earlier. The palace will not blame you. No one will think you killed me." The second prince lowered his head. His blood-stained hand fumbled in his clothes and pulled out a letter. Gently, he placed it on the table. Unexpectedly, before he died, he had even thought of what Fan Xian was worried about. Fan Xian's heart froze slightly. He knew that the other person was as Ling said. He was ruthless toward himself to a certain realm and had cut off any hope of survival. The second prince raised his head and glanced at Fan Xian with an envious gaze. He then vomited up another mouthful of black blood. He used his sleeve to carelessly wipe his lips. Using two slender fingers, he carefully broke off the grapes stained by the poisonous blood. Leaving behind a small, clean half, he sent it back in his mouth. The sweet and juicy grapes were chewed into mush in his mouth. The second prince spat out the grape seeds. He spat them onto the ground, still carrying black blood. After eating the grapes, he wiped his hands clean on his body and sighed. Looking at Fan Xian, who had been silent and not moving, he faintly said, "I don't want to continue living as a joke." Fan Xian nodded to indicate that he understood his thoughts. "Actually, you're also a joke." A layer of deathly gray gradually rose to the second prince's face. His gaze was slightly unfocused. Thinking of something, he said, "There are a lot of people in Jingdo who want to kill you. Yes, the first person to act was me. But do you think Changqian has been gentle toward you?" The Qin family didn't kill you in the valley. He was so angry he jumped all night in the Eastern Palace. But why? He stared into Fan Xian's eyes. Why is it that your attitude toward Changxian is completely different from how you treat me? Fan Xian himself did not understand this point. The second prince was about to die, and his words were also straightforward. They pierced straight into his heart. Why was it that he had always been so tolerant and gentle toward the crown prince, but pestered the second prince relentlessly and spared no expense? The second prince's eyelids drooped weakly, and his voice was extremely low. You don't like me. You didn't like me from the beginning. Of course, I don't like you either. The two of us are too similar. It's just that I've never had such good luck as you. No matter who it is, no one will allow another to exist in the world. Everyone will unconsciously try to get rid of the other first. His gaze was cold and helpless. If you are Prince Jia of the Rongwa Manor, then I can only be Zhan Baoyu of Jinling. I will never get many chances to appear in the novel, but I am the real one. I am the real one. As the second prince spoke, he coughed up blood. The blood was smeared all over the front of his clothes. He appeared very wretched. Fan Xian looked at the scene in front of him. His body was stiff, and he couldn't make any reaction. The second prince raised his head for the last time and stared at Fan Xian's face. With some difficulty, he said, I always thought Changxian was the most cowardly of all the brothers. Only when I was about to die did I realize that I was also very cowardly. I would rather die and humbly leave Ling and Mother than have the courage to face, after I die, help me take care of Ling. As for Mother, her best ending is probably to be banished into the cold palace. Please help me take care of her. The second prince's chest rose and fell violently as if something was about to charge out. He stared into Fan Xian's eyes and forced himself to finish speaking. He didn't give Fan Xian any chance to speak. Opening his mouth, he spat out a large pool of black blood and stopped breathing. After death, the second prince continued to crouch on the chair with his left hand on his knee. His handsome face carried a deathly ashen color. A moment later, his body fell off the chair with a thud. However, his eyes refused to close and were wide open. Fan Xian looked at the second prince's body with a numb expression. He suddenly felt that this early autumn night could be so cold. He shivered. His emotions were complicated. He didn't know what kind of sigh he should make about the body in front of him. Perhaps silence was the best attitude. The second prince, the true prince, was already dead. How could the fake soul in his body continue? His expression was not very good. It was not because the second prince had committed suicide in front of him, nor was it because of the heart-wrenching words the second prince had said before he died. Rather, in the end, the second prince had asked him to help him take care of Ling and Lady Shu. He didn't even give him a chance to refuse. Fan Xian thought to himself. His expression was desolate. When the eldest princess died, she gave one to him. The crown prince knew that he was going to die, so he entrusted the families of the rebel soldiers and officials to him. Why? Don't you know that I am your irreconcilable enemy? Was your death not caused by me? Why do you throw so many burdens at me before you die? Do you want to crush me to death? Are you betting that I will help you? You dead people. If you die, then die. Why do you want me, a living person, to live so uncomfortably? He lowered his head and was incomparably wooden. His body trembled slightly. He then walked to the side of the second prince's body and glanced at it. He picked up the thin wool from the table and put it into his clothes. Then, he walked out of the sinister room. Walking to the bedroom in the back garden of the manor, Yi Linger was still sitting woodenly under the cold light of the green lantern. She had no idea what had happened in the back garden. Fan Xian sighed in his heart and walked directly behind her. Striking down with his palm, he didn't give her any chance to react before knocking her out. If he didn't knock her out, once she learned of the second prince's suicide by poison, she would probably follow him. Fan Xian could only use this more direct method to delay the matter. Gong Dian came forward to greet him. Fan Xian lowered his head and thought for a moment. He then handed the will in his clothes to him. At the same time, he handed Yi Linger, who was on his shoulder, to him and said something in a low voice. Gong Dian accepted the unconscious Yi Linger. He was already very shocked. Hearing the news of the second prince's death, He furrowed his brows tightly. The second prince wrote a will. The emperor won't blame you or me. Fan Xian sighed. Immediately after, he said seriously, before Wang Fei wakes up, first tie up her hands and feet. Then tell her this news. If she doesn't want to eat, force rice soup down my throat. No matter what, she has to drink it. These last two sentences had already been roared out through gritted teeth. They were incomparably sinister. Gong Jian thought that this was indeed the only way. He didn't notice the Duke of Dambua's loss of composure. After thinking for a moment, he helplessly said, "But the young lady's personality is like a raging fire. We can't tie her up for the rest of her life." Fire is not scary. It comes quickly and goes quickly. It's not as piercing as a lump of ice like me and the second prince, Fan Xian thought to himself. Lowering his voice, he said, "After a few days, when things have calmed down a bit, I'll come and try to persuade her." After he finished dealing with the matters of the manor, the night in Jingdo had gradually receded. It was already early in the morning. In the distant east, a faint sliver of white peeked out. However, Fan Xian had no way of resting. He still had too many things to do. After circling back to the Fan Manor from the manor, he went directly to the royal palace. Although Minister Fan had said that these matters should be handled by the Board of Rites Taichung Temple, Fan Xian could not forget his identity as regent and pretend these things had never happened. Furthermore, he was also the vice minister of Taichung Temple, Minister Ren Xiao, and had followed the emperor to Dong Mountain to worship heaven. He didn't know if he would survive. He and the great prince stood side by side. Looking at the three black coffins in front of them, the two brothers were silent. Just a day ago, the two of them had been standing on the palace walls worrying about the safety of the palace and the world of the Qin kingdom. Who would have thought that at this moment, victory and defeat had already been decided? The people who wrote the history of the world had already changed their names. Who would have thought that at the moment of danger in the royal palace, the black coffins under Fan Xian's feet had already begun to contain the skin of the defeated? The eldest princess and the second prince were lying quietly in the coffins. There was another coffin that was empty. No one knew who was going to lie in it next. This is not in accordance with etiquette. The great prince's expression was heavy. He struggled not to show sorrow between his brows. The eldest princess was one thing, but the brotherly affection between him and the second prince, Li Chengze, could not be faked. Although the two brothers had gradually drifted apart during these 2 years, looking at the scene in front of him and thinking of the people in the coffins, the great prince's heart still ached. Fan Xian nodded his head tiredly and said, "The officials of the Board of Rites have all been scared away. It looks like as long as the emperor doesn't return to the capital, the 6 ministries will not be able to be gathered together. There aren't many people in Taichung Temple either. They're just temporary accommodations. After all, the face of the royal family has to be taken care of. They can't just stay in the manor." The great prince sighed and didn't say anything more. He turned and walked into the royal palace. Compared to the group of imperial soldiers escorting the coffins, his figure appeared very desolate. Fan Xian looked at him calmly and shook his head. He knew that in the face of the repeated heavy pressure and the gradually arriving news of death, the great prince was almost unable to hold out. Thinking of this, only then did Fan Xian feel waves of exhaustion coming from the depths of his body. He could barely keep his eyelids open. Furrowing his brows, he slapped his face and said to the subordinate beside him, "Return to the manor." In one night, he had returned to the manor 4 times, but there was not a moment of peace. Fan Xian thought about it carefully. From the beginning of the preparations before breaking into the palace, he had not slept for 2 days and 2 nights. His injuries had already relapsed. The power of the ephedra pill had completely worn off. He didn't dare take it again. His entire body's energy and strength had indeed reached their limits. After returning to the manor, Fan Xian looked at everything in the dark night. He didn't go to see Wan who was staying in Lady Lu's room. He lowered his head and sat silently on the bed for a while. He then kicked the black chest under the bed. Without even taking off his clothes, he lay down with his arms spread out. He was clearly exhausted, yet he couldn't sleep. He opened his bright eyes and looked at the dark ceiling. He didn't sleep for long before he woke up. After all, Jingdo was still in chaos. As the regent, he could not give himself too much time to rest and be sad. After getting out of bed, he randomly ate something and used a hot towel to soak his face, forcefully recovering his energy. As he walked out the door, he unconsciously glanced down at the bed. That fatal chest, the chest that often stayed in the dust, lay quietly under the bed. It was like the eldest princess and second prince lying quietly in their coffins. No one would ever disturb them again. Regardless of whether it was a chest or a person, perhaps only by becoming an unremarkable existence and placed in an unremarkable place could they obtain true peace. As he left the manor, he unconsciously glanced back inside. After returning from Taiping Courtyard, he still hadn't seen Wan Er. He didn't know what his wife's mood was. Thinking of this, a glimmer of darkness rose to his face. As he entered the palace, he unconsciously glanced toward the palace doors. There were fire and smoke marks everywhere on the red palace doors. Some of the cracks caused by weapons were gaping open, revealing the wood shavings inside. The copper nails that had been knocked off had long been cleaned up. There were only countless ugly scars left on the doors. In this instant, Fan Xian confirmed some things. This palace, this city, and this country were, after all, the place he had lived for 20 years. He had already developed deep feelings for this place. Even though this palace was cold and gloomy, even though this city had let down many people, and even though this country had made a great mistake, it was still his country. He had always thought of himself as a Qing person. There were many things that he had not investigated clearly. Before he understood them, he didn't mind doing his best to maintain the peace of the people in this country while he lived a beautiful life, just as he had done all these years. So many people had died, so he had to live well. Unless some people didn't want him to live. He invited the scholars Hu and Shu back to their manors to temporarily rest. These two officials had already been in the royal study drafting up the imperial edicts for an entire night. Some of the important memorials to the Qing kingdom had finally been roughly sorted out. However, the two scholars were not made of iron. Their mental state was much worse than Fan Xian's. After receiving a series of shocks and not sleeping, they were long exhausted. Fan Xian sat in the empty royal study and couldn't help but shake his head. Usually, when the emperor was here, although the royal study was just as quiet, it was always filled with a different feeling. Was it dignity? Or something else? In any case, it was completely different from the royal study he sensed. He didn't know how the emperor had come down from Dong Mountain alive, but he knew that his performance would certainly satisfy the emperor. It looked like his position as a powerful official could be secured. However, when he thought of the war that would open the curtains in 2 or 3 years, Fan Xian felt a bit of bitterness in his mouth. It was said that a gentleman did not bully a darkroom. However, Fan Xian was not a gentleman. He sat alone in the royal study, looking at the mountainous piles of memorials on the low platform and the soft couch. He thought of how the emperor had been controlling the entire Qing kingdom's court politics from there. His heart jumped. He stood up and looked calmly in that direction. Slightly tilting his head, he wondered what it would feel like if he sat there. Immediately after, he shook his head. His thin lips twitched slightly, revealing a glimmer of self-mockery. Being regent for a day and night had almost tired him out like a big yellow dog in the summer. Looking at the wretched appearance of the scholars Hu and Shu being supported by the eunuchs, Fan Xian confirmed that the emperor's job was certainly more tiring than that of the Yellow Emperor, who had countless women every day. It was still that old saying. There were only 3 kinds of people in the world: men, women, and the emperor. Anyone who could be a true ruler was not a person. Invite the 3rd prince over. Fan Xian smiled slightly and spoke to the little eunuch outside the royal study. He immediately thought of Hong Zhu and some of the people involved in the rebellion who were still imprisoned in the cold palace. He didn't know how the emperor would handle this matter after he returned. However, in the eyes of an outsider, Hong Zhu had basically done nothing, so there shouldn't be any major problems. In just a few years, the 3rd prince, Li Changping, who had gradually grown into a youthful appearance, arrived outside the royal study accompanied by an old nanny and a few eunuchs. Fanxian glanced at the old nanny and waved his hand for them to leave. Holding the third prince's hand, he came to the front of the desk where the memorials were kept. Li Chengping's hand was slightly cold. The gaze with which he looked at Fanxian was also different from when he was in Jiangnan. It appeared to be somewhat respectful. Fanxian had already noticed this scene out of the corner of his eye, but he did not care much. He was respectful and fearful, but there was no sense of alienation. He knew that his performance this day and night had left a deep impression on this brother of his. He would probably never be able to shake off this kind of mark. This was a problem in education. Other than Fanxian, no one in this world understood it. In order to raise a prince who dared to open a brothel and kill people at the age of 9 into a kind ruler, pure moral teachings were not enough to complete the task. He had to let the third prince understand that there were many things in this world that could be achieved through more open and above-board methods. The third prince needed a role model. From the beginning of the Jiangnan trip, Fanxian had set himself as the role model in the third prince's heart because he was an immortal poet, a warrior, a powerful official, and the savior of the third prince. In the hearts of most of the people of Qin Kingdom, he was a good person. Fanxian hoped that the future emperor of Qin Kingdom would also be a good person, just like the crown prince. Sir, I heard father. Li Chengping looked at Fanxian with some fear. Fanxian smiled. With the temple above, the emperor has the mandate of heaven to protect him. Naturally, those thieves and rascals cannot harm him. Oh, a glimmer of joy rose to Li Chengping's face. Although he knew that if his father died, he would become the next emperor of Qin Kingdom under the protection of his teacher and brother, he was, after all, still a youth. His thoughts were not that ruthless. Fanxian pretended not to care, but he carefully paid attention to the change of emotions in Li Chengping's eyes. He thought to himself that he had indeed not seen wrong. In the future, the emperor will probably often have you come to the royal study to listen. After Fanxian said this, he paused and slowly opened his mouth to say, "Your Highness should first familiarize yourself with the place." The third prince had come to the royal study before, and knew that his brothers, the crown prince, his second brother, his eldest brother, and even his teacher would always listen to his father and the officials discuss matters in the royal study after the court meeting. However, after today, this royal study would probably be much emptier. "There are many things that probably no one dares to say to your Highness," Fanxian said calmly after thinking for a moment. "But I must tell you." The emperor was about to return. Fanxian had to give his own explanation to the third prince, because he knew that this child's thoughts were actually very meticulous. Earlier, he had always used "Your Highness" to refer to him. The great prince's nature is martial. In the future, he will be sent to the borders to guard. Fanxian's expression was slightly heavy. Using his own words, he described the emperor's future plans. His nature is straightforward. He will not take the initiative to do anything that will harm the Brotherhood. You can rest assured on this point. Don't be suspicious. The third prince's hand trembled. Looking at his teacher's face, he didn't know why he was suddenly saying this. "As for me, I will eventually leave. The world is so big. I have to go to the ends of the earth to take a look. Only then will I not have wasted my life." Fanxian smiled slightly. "So, don't be suspicious of me. Even after you grow up, don't be suspicious of me." The third prince opened his mouth wide. For some reason, he felt a glimmer of fear. These are not words that an official should say. Fanxian withdrew his smile and calmly said, "But I want to say it to you. In the 20 years of my life, I have grown tired of guessing and testing each other's intentions. Regardless of whether or not you still believe these words when you grow up, please remember these words." Just as he had said, these words had already violated the emperor's family's great taboo. Furthermore, they had come from the mouth of an official. Yet, Fanxian had said them so calmly and naturally. Li Chengping looked in a daze at his teacher's originally handsome but slightly sallow face and unconsciously nodded his head. 3 days had passed. Jingdo had already been pacified. The 3 riders once again entered the capital and announced to the world the news of the emperor's return from worshipping heaven. The Jingdo people, still shaken, were overjoyed. Standing on the palace walls, Fanxian didn't know what they were happy about after suffering so much. The emperor's scheduled return to the capital was 3 days late. During these 3 days, the Dingzhou army's military intelligence reports came endlessly to the capital through the military and Overwatch Council's channels. Fanxian had enough of being a regent. With both hands, he held the emperor's royal seal and randomly stamped it. On this day, the news finally arrived. Fanxian brought the third prince, the great prince, and the surviving royalist old officials through the streets that still had the marks of war. Walking out of Jingyang Gate, they stopped 10 li away. Thousands of people knelt down densely. There was no space on the road. Many people knelt directly in the wheat fields on either side of the road. At this time, the autumn harvest had not arrived. The golden ears of wheat survived the trampling of the war horses and swayed in the wind with the heavy harvest. Countless people's emotions swayed like the ears of wheat as they watched the bright yellow royal entourage coming from afar. Fanxian pulled his gaze back from the wheat fields and smiled slightly at the nervous and joyful third prince beside him. After canvassing for votes yesterday, I rushed to second place in the monthly votes. In my memory, this seems to be the first time in the Qingyu year that I have reached second place. Although the second prince died, quite tragically today, I'm still as nervous and joyful as the third prince. Alas, I have lived most of my life as a bachelor. Thank you. Chapter 585. The royal carriage slowly arrived and steadily stopped on the road. Because of the chaos and panic of the battle, the road had not been paved with yellow earth or sprinkled with water. However, the emperor's feet still did not have any hesitation. Firmly and steadily, he walked down the steps and stepped onto the land around Jingdou. The emperor moved his hand away from eunuch Yao's elbow. His calm gaze slowly swept across the wilderness. Thousands of officials and soldiers were kneeling on the ground and worshiping him. His expression was indifferent, but there was not much emotion in his eyes. Amidst the earth-shaking mountain cries, the emperor's gaze moved closer from the distant Jingdou walls and landed nearby. It flashed past the scholars Hu and Shu, the great prince in martial attire, and his nervous and slightly happy youngest son. In the end, it lightly landed on Fanxian's handsome and threatening face. He noticed that there was a strong sense of tiredness on this boy's face. The corners of the emperor's lips twitched slightly with a hint of joy. It was as if he was growing to like this pretty face more and more in the depths of his heart. His brows immediately furrowed because he found that Fanxian had suffered a serious internal injury. Spreading out his bright yellow dragon robe, the emperor stretched out his arms. Calmly and domineeringly, he faced the wilderness in front of him. The mountain cries gradually stopped. If no one dared to look at the emperor, how could these thousands of people know the emperor's actions? From the moment they got out of the car, the emperor's gaze had basically landed on Fanxian. Fanxian felt uncomfortable all over, but he kept his head down. He didn't know how to react. After hearing the cheers, the emperor's feet gradually moved toward them. Just as he was about to walk in front of Fanxian, the emperor suddenly changed his direction and did not look at Fanxian again. Solemnly, he helped Shu Wu and Hu the scholar to their feet. His hands gripped old Shu's shoulders. Using a gentle and firm tone, he said, "You've suffered." Shu Wu's heart jumped. Fear appeared on his face. Hu the scholar also repeatedly said he didn't dare. The emperor smiled and didn't say anything. Immediately after, he helped up the great prince, who had led the soldiers in the Jingdou battle and achieved great merit. The emperor's emotions toward this eldest son he had never liked much were complicated, but his expression was calm. Following this, the emperor pulled Li Chengping up and used his right hand to gently stroke his youngest son's head for a while. His gaze looked around at the officials loyal to him and didn't say a word. Then, he turned around and walked back to the royal carriage. Everyone was dumbfounded, thinking that it was over just like that. It was not about whether or not the emperor's return ceremony had finished. Rather, it was about the most meritorious service in protecting the country, the Duke of Danbois still kneeling stiffly on the ground. Why did the emperor not say anything at all? Shu Wu and Hu the scholar met each other's eyes and saw the confusion in each other's eyes. Fan Xian was also a bit confused. He didn't know if he should stand up. Get up. Could it be that you won't be able to stand up if I don't help you up? Before he boarded the royal carriage, the emperor lightly tossed out these words to the crowd. Although these words did not point to anyone, everyone knew that they were directed at Fan Xian. Furthermore, they appeared cold, but in reality, there was a sliver of closeness within. As for the other meaning hidden in these words, only Fan Xian could understand. The emperor had already recognized his ability and loyalty. Without needing his support, he could also stand in his own position in court. Fan Xian laughed bitterly and stood up. He lowered his head to look at the dirt on his knees. Logically speaking, the emperor had not yet boarded the carriage. As an official, he could not clean up his appearance. However, an impulse came from somewhere and made his right hand brush at his knees, brushing away some of the dirt. This small action did not attract too much attention. It made the emperor's figure, who was about to board the royal carriage, pause slightly. Then, everyone heard the emperor's words. "Enji, come into the carriage." The officials began to stare dumbfounded again. They looked at each other and sank into shock. Earlier, the emperor had not personally helped Fan Xian stand up. Everyone had some guesses. Who would have thought that the emperor would immediately give Sir Fan Jr. such an honor to follow the emperor into the capital? What kind of honor was this? Even the crown prince had never enjoyed it in the past. The gazes of the clever officials toward Fan Xian became heated. However, these officials appeared too clever, or perhaps they thought they were clever. Some of their gazes involuntarily landed on the third prince. Everyone knew that the crown prince and the second prince would not have a good ending because of the rebellion. At the beginning, everyone thought that the future master of the Qin kingdom would be this young prince. Looking at the emperor's attitude, the reason these officials thought they were clever was because they had displayed an inappropriate attitude in an inappropriate place. The scholars Hu and Shu looked down as if they had not heard the emperor's words at all. This was the difference between high-ranking officials and officials. Fan Xian tasted bitterness in his mouth, but he could not go against the imperial edict. He walked to the side of the tall royal carriage, lifted the yellow curtain, and stood in front of the emperor. Although the royal carriage was tall, it was still unable to allow a person to stand straight. Thus, he was forced to lower his head in front of the emperor, just like everyone else in the world. "Sit." The emperor seemed to see through his thoughts and said with a slight nod of his head. Fan Xian obeyed and sat across from the emperor. Looking at the emperor he had not seen for a month, his emotions gradually became complicated. In the past, although the emperor had also had a bright and powerful side, he was not as terrifying as the emperor now. The emperor was still calm, but he was like a bottomless abyss, hiding an unfathomable power. This kind of feeling made Fan Xian's heart palpitate. Looking at the two straight eyebrows and calm eyes, he involuntarily felt the thought of retreating rise in his heart. The emperor's domineering aura did not appear from his outer appearance. Instead, it appeared in the history books through his methods and results. To be able to come back alive from Dong Mountain, to be able to arrange such a situation, and to be such a powerful figure, he was indeed worthy of being the foremost person in the land in 30 years. Fan Xian understood this reality and could only accept it. The middle-aged man wearing the dragon robe lowered his head to look at the urgent memorials the two scholars had presented. He did not pay attention to Fan Xian's gaze toward him, even if this kind of gaze toward the emperor was extremely impolite and taboo. The royal carriage slowly began to move. The light from outside the window slanted in and shone on the memorials in the emperor's hands. He lowered his head and furrowed his brows as he looked at these things. Suddenly, he said, 3 years. My Qin kingdom still needs 3 years. When he said this, the emperor did not raise his head. It was as if he was talking to himself. Fan Xian knew what the emperor meant. After experiencing an internal rebellion, putting aside the serious damage Jingdo had suffered and the chaos of court politics, just the internal attacks in the military had already caused serious consequences. The military's morale was already unstable. Additionally, The officials in the Dongshan Road area involved many people. Although the emperor had already chosen good officials from Jiangnan to replace them, the impact on the people's lives would certainly be great. It would take at least a year to gather the military's morale and remove the psychological effects of this chaos. The Qing kingdom would need at least 3 years to truly prepare for a large-scale battle in terms of wealth, resources, and the hearts of the people. Presumably, in the emperor's heart, this northern expedition to unify the world would be the last one. The progress of history that had been stopped by the two great grandmasters for over 20 years would slowly speed up. The light from outside the window shone in through the glass and endlessly brushed back, sprinkling countless glass flowers on the father and son's faces. The emperor still had his head down and said, "When the matter is done, brush off one's clothes and leave, hide one's body and name deeply." These are the words he once wrote. However, don't hope that I will let you go. When the matter is done, the matter is not over. Why is a young man like you in a hurry to brush off your clothes and leave? The emperor's eyes looked at the memorial. These words seemed to have been spoken unintentionally, but Fan Xian's heart thumped. He didn't know what to say. When the matter was done, brush off one's clothes and leave. He had not thought that his unconsciously brushing off the dust in front of the royal carriage would allow the emperor to guess his thoughts. Furthermore, the emperor had resolutely and mercilessly dispelled his illusions or probing in his heart. He laughed bitterly and didn't dare to hide anything. Straightforwardly, he said, "I'm truly not good at things like fighting wars. It's better to peacefully earn some money for the court." Fan Xian had other plans in his heart, so he rushed to speak clearly. Unexpectedly, the emperor suddenly raised his head and looked at him. "Don't think about resigning. If you're still afraid of what people say, I will naturally do the matter of reducing your power." Fan Xian cried out bitterly in his heart. The emperor's words had forced him into a corner. If he was truly forced to stay in Jingdou to plot, he did not want his power to be reduced. The Overwatch Council was the most powerful weapon in his hands. If the emperor actually tore it open, what would he use to negotiate terms with this unfathomable emperor? Until now, he still didn't know the truth of what happened on Dong Mountain. He didn't dare to open his mouth to ask in the carriage. It was the emperor who spoke first and asked about the specific situation in Jingdou. Although Jingdou had continuously sent memorials to the royal carriage during these 3 days, the matter involved the secret of the royal family. There were many things that could only be reported personally by Fan Xian to the emperor. Fan Xian's voice rang out in the carriage. From the moment he left Dong Mountain to when he disguised himself as an oil merchant to enter Jingdou, to the later plan with the Great Prince, the surprise attack on the royal palace, and finally the Yi family's attack, he spoke methodically and clearly. He purposely downplayed some details that the emperor presumably did not want to hear. When Fan Xian made his report, the emperor had already lowered his head again. That was why he carefully watched the emperor's expression and reaction. Unexpectedly, regardless of whether it was the news of the eldest princess' death or the second prince's suicide, none of them made the emperor's stone-like face tremble at all. It was only when he reported the Empress Dowager's illness that the emperor raised his head. How many days does the Empress Dowager have left? I've seen her at the Imperial Academy of Medicine. Her body is weak, and she has experienced such a major event. She has been frightened. I'm afraid. Fan Xian stopped talking. He had a malicious thought toward the cold emperor. The Empress Dowager was scared to death by you. What should you, as a filial emperor, do? The Imperial Academy of Medicine? The emperor furrowed his brows and looked at him coldly. What is the use of those pieces of trash? You were in the palace. Don't you know the details? Fan Xian said darkly. It is indeed not something a person can reverse. Under the gazes and protection of countless people, the emperor's entourage entered Jingdou. Following the wide and straight Tianhe Avenue, it entered the royal palace. Along the way, the common people who had just suffered the disaster of war forcefully suppressed the sorrow or fear in their hearts and joyfully welcomed the emperor's return. It was as if they were welcoming back the backbone of their lives. From this, it could be seen that the emperor's prestige and reputation among the Qing people was still as strong and unbreakable as monarchical power itself. Arriving at the front doors of the royal palace, Fan Xian retreated from the carriage with his body bent. Meeting the great prince's gaze, he shook his head, indicating that the emperor's mood was fine and had not been affected by the successive news of deaths. Fan Xian followed the carriage into the palace. Looking at the bright yellow curtains, he couldn't help but think of the emperor's expression earlier. Involuntarily, he felt a chill in his heart. Although the eldest princess and the second prince were both the masterminds of the rebellion, they were, after all, the emperor's own sister and son. Furthermore, looking at the rebellion now, it was clear that the emperor had purposely set up a trap for the other party. Yet, after learning of the death of his sister and son, the emperor was still calm. This determination, this cold-bloodedness, truly made him shiver in fear. The great prince walked to his side and said in a heavy voice, "Why did you come down? Did you dare to sit all the way into the palace?" Fan Xian glanced at him and explained in a low voice. The emperor asked some questions in the carriage. You know that it is not convenient to announce these things in public. There was originally no need to explain anything to the great prince. However, Fan Xian looked at the gazes focused on him from all around. He knew what kind of discussion and consequences it would cause if he followed the royal entourage into the capital, so he unconsciously added this sentence. After he finished, he felt that talking to the great prince like this would probably have the opposite effect. He smiled bitterly and said, "It was too cold in the carriage, so I came down to stretch my bones." The great prince smiled and patted his shoulder. He didn't say anything. These two brothers were actually both forcing themselves to smile, guarding Jingdo to prevent the ruler of a country from becoming a lonely spirit in the land. Without question, they had performed a great service. However, so many people in the royal family had died, and they had used so many tricks. Who knew what the emperor was thinking? The Qing emperor didn't think of anything. In the process of arranging to wipe out the rebel army outside the capital, he had already learned of Li Yunrui and Li Cheng's deaths from the urgent documents Fan Xian had sent. In the carriage, he only learned the specific circumstances of their deaths from Fan Xian's mouth. His expression was calm, as if the people who had died were strangers. He continued to look at the memorials the Hall of Governmental Affairs had presented. When the royal entourage entered the palace and Fan Xian got off the carriage, the emperor put down the memorial in his hands. Leaning against the back of the chair, he closed his eyes and said nothing in silence. The lonely silence continued for a long time. A glimmer of old age and haggard gradually appeared on the emperor's face. At this moment, the carriage had already stopped in front of Han Dian. He gently sighed and slowly walked out of the carriage curtain that eunuch Yao had pulled up. Once he was out of the curtain, he looked down at the familiar yet strange palace. His expression quickly became calm and solemn. There was no longer a trace of the gloominess he had when he was alone in the carriage. Every brow and gaze conveyed his strength and strength. The Empress Dowager wore a plain white dress and lay on the warm and soft phoenix bed. The wrinkles on her face were deep. It was as if she had once faced too much wind and rain with this royal palace and had been eroded to this state. The emperor said something to the terrified imperial physician kneeling on the ground. He then sat by the side of the bed and placed his slender fingers on the Empress Dowager's wrist. Fan Xian and the other two brothers stood obediently behind the curtain, not daring to disturb them. Fan Xian's heart was faintly nervous. He could faintly see that the emperor's technique in taking the pulse was very skilled. It was clear that he also had some understanding of medicine. However, he had more confidence in Sir Fei Jie's medicine. Most importantly, that pill was not poison. Regardless of whether it was the Imperial Academy of Medicine or other brilliant doctors, presumably, none of them would be able to find the true reason for the Empress Dowager's gradual decline. Instead, they would straightforwardly conclude that she was getting old and weak and that her fate was coming to an end. The Emperor's slender fingers had already left the Empress Dowager's weak pulse. He lowered his head and thought deeply for a moment. A glimmer of helplessness flashed through his eyes. It looked like this great Grandmaster also knew that he could not delay his mother's departure. Then, his brows suddenly furrowed. His finger moved like the wind and tapped between the Empress Dowager's brows. With the tap, the atmosphere in Hongguang Palace changed. The cold autumn wind was dispersed by a wave of unstoppable sunlight. A powerful and upright aura passed into everyone's heart. Fan Xian suddenly felt the aura behind the curtain. His heart jumped, and his fingers began to tremble rapidly. Although this aura was not familiar, it was as harmonious as the Jinqi in his body. However, it was many levels higher than his realm. Faintly, it was the realm he had always longed for, but had never been able to find the door to. He abruptly raised his head and stared in a daze through the thin curtain. A voice in his heart cried out to him. This is the second half of the volume. This was the second half of the volume that he had practiced for 20 years, but had no progress at all. I seem to have made the same mistake as the rapeseed flower in Vermilion Bird. It looks like I am walking down the path of not distinguishing between the 5 grains. Fortunately, this is the Qing Kingdom. The title of this chapter is the second half of the father and son. Everyone should know that this is a pun. This story is about to enter the final stage. There are still about 6 or 7 more chapters in this volume. Then, it will enter the last volume, Emperor of the Dynasty. I have confidence that this is a corrected version. I mistyped the name of the last volume earlier. Chapter 586. The reason I updated late today was because of the men's basketball finals. I really couldn't help but finish reading, so I finished late. Also, at the end of the chapter, I narcissistically said 4 words, I have confidence. Then, I immediately realized that I had gotten the name of the last volume wrong. Although I changed it later, the last volume was Chao Tian Tianzi. Readers with good memories should remember that I mentioned it before. After Fan Xian came to this world, he had begun to learn the nameless martial secret his mother had supposedly left for him when he was still a baby. It was a thin book with yellow pages. The martial secret was divided into 2 volumes. Wu Zhu had once said to him that the first volume was tyrannical. What about the second volume? Only an irresponsible male nanny like Wu Zhu would so casually hold such a dangerous martial secret by an infant's side. Only a strange creature like Fan Xian would begin to practice before he even knew how to run. Fan Xian took afternoon naps, and then another. 16 years of afternoon naps were 16 years of quiet cultivation. Because he was greedy for life and afraid of death, his willpower was astonishing. Even after he entered the capital, his cultivation still did not slack off. After 20 years of hard cultivation, he was as familiar with the first and second volumes of the nameless martial secret as he could be. From the age of 3, he had stopped reading books. They were all deeply imprinted in his mind. When he was 12, Wu Zhu's staff hit him, and he broke through the bottleneck of the tyrannical martial secret. After many years of life and death fighting, the shattering of his meridians in the alleys of Jingdo behind the Hanging Temple, the mutual meditation with Haidang on the trip to Jiangnan, and using the natural heart of Tianyi Dao to heal his wounds, his control of the tyrannical Jinqi had reached a near-perfect realm. Presently, he was one of the youngest 9th-level aces in the world. He knew that he was not a genius like Haidang and 13th Wang. It was just that the meridians in his body were different from others. Furthermore, he had put in time and energy that others could not. Heaven rewarded the diligent, and Fan Xian had won in the word diligent. However, he still had no way of dealing with the second half of the nameless martial secret, because the Jinqi in the second half of the book, as well as the path of circulation, appeared very strange. Never mind normal people in the world. Even a strange creature like him, with thick meridians, had no way of dealing with it. Yes, there was a mountain of treasures in front of him, but he couldn't even find the path up the mountain because the clear light on the mountain was attracting him. However, if he wanted to climb the mountain, he would be forced to dig out this mountain. Who could do that? If the tyrannical Jinqi needed to be supported by a vast meridian, then the second half of the manual required even more terrifying. Every time Fan Xian made no progress in his cultivation, he would feel extremely disappointed. Occasionally, he would think that unless there were no meridians in the entire body, or to put another way, A person's meridians were all connected and scattered among the organs and limbs. It would be impossible to cultivate the second half of the scroll. For many years, Fan Xian had been troubled by this problem. He could not find any possibility of a breakthrough. Uncle Wu Zhu had never practiced Xinqi. When he was in Jiangnan, he had occasionally said a few vague words to Haidang, but Haidang only shook her head. This kind of Xinqi method required a person without meridians. It was clearly a joke. A person without meridians was, without question, a dead person. Thus, during this year, Fan Xian gradually gave up on the idea of practicing the second half of the nameless martial secret. If Wu Zhu had not told him many years ago that someone had successfully practiced this martial secret, Fan Xian would probably have thought that the second half of the nameless martial secret was a terrifying joke used by previous sages to harm people. Now, Fan Xian was outside Hongguang Palace's curtain. He clearly and with incomparable shock felt that kind of realm, a realm he had never reached or even seen before. It seeped out from behind the curtain and attacked his heart. If the tyrannical Xinqi was a mountain-splitting axe, then the aura in the curtain was like the lightning blade in the hands of God. The aura was even more pure and exquisite. It was neutral and peaceful, upright and upright. It came out of the blue and spread between heaven and earth, immediately making one feel a sense of worship. Fan Xian knew he could not be wrong. This kind of aura definitely came from the same source as the tyrannical Xinqi in his body. It was just that the realm was a few levels higher. When a realm that he had searched up and down for over a dozen years and could not understand suddenly appeared in front of his eyes, his entire body froze. He sank into some kind of imperceptible excitement. Other than excitement, he even felt a glimmer of fear. The emperor lifted the curtain and walked out. Glancing at everyone, he quietly said, "The Empress Dowager is tired. You all go wait outside the palace." No one knew what the emperor wanted to say. They bowed to receive the edict. Only Fan Xian remained standing in a daze. With his head half lowered, he looked at the emperor's dragon robe in a daze. The corners of the emperor's lips curled up slightly as he smiled. He knew that his son had sensed something. If it wasn't for the fact that this boy had been practicing the tyrannical martial method since he was young, how could anyone else have such a deep understanding and such a strong shock? Fan Xian's dazed appearance was actually mostly faked. He knew that in front of the emperor, he could not completely hide the shock in his heart. He simply let down his defenses and naturally revealed the thoughts in his mind. The emperor was a great grandmaster. The emperor had practiced the second half of the scroll. Fan Xian knew that the emperor knew that he could know, so he had to show his shock and terror. The emperor looked at him and slowly said a moment later, "Go to the Eastern Palace and wait for me. If you have anything to say, say it later." Fan Xian swallowed and smiled bitterly. After bowing, he left Hongguang Palace. The palace returned to its silence. Other than the Empress Dowager, who was lying on the bed and unable to make a single sound, there was also the emperor sitting quietly by the bed. The emperor sat silently by the Empress Dowager's side. He held her hand gently in his palm and lowered his head to think about the scene earlier. That child should know and have guessed it. The emperor had not planned to continue hiding these things from Fan Xian. After all, after the battle at Dong Mountain, there was no need to continue hiding it. Other than Fan Xian, there shouldn't be anyone else who could sense the uniqueness of the martial secret the emperor practiced. Thinking of Fan Xian's shocked expression earlier, the emperor's expression softened. He thought to himself that he had suffered all these years. He had to make it up to him. However, regarding this martial secret, even if he wanted to make it up to him, Fan Xian would not be able to accept it. He glanced at the Empress Dowager again. The emperor's expression was slightly dim. Just as Fan Xian had guessed, even a great grandmaster would not be able to sense the slightest change in the old woman's body. The secret medicine that Fei Jia had solemnly handed over indeed had its own wonders. The emperor sat by the bed thinking about something. After a long time, he suddenly opened his mouth and said in a gentle voice, "Mother, I still have many things I want to tell you and many glories I want to share with you." His hand gently held the Empress Dowager's hand. His body was not very tall and straight. On the contrary, it was slightly timid. Even the most heartless person in the world would probably feel some unease and sorrow as they watched their birth mother gradually leave this world. Faint gauze fluttered in the early autumn Hongguang Palace. The emperor's face grew paler and paler. His grip on the Empress Dowager's hand grew tighter and tighter. Large amounts of pure kingly jinqi poured endlessly into the Empress Dowager's body. Perhaps it was the realm of a great grandmaster that could truly slow down the pace of death's arrival. Perhaps anyone would have a moment before death. The Empress Dowager's eyelids trembled slightly. Her eyeballs moved slightly. It was as if she was about to open her eyes and wake up. However, she still could not open them. Adding on Yi Luyun, it was no wonder Sigajian and Ku he had fallen to such a state. He sighed. His mood was dim. Once again, he confirmed the emperor's cold-blooded heartlessness. That year, his meridians had shattered and he had almost lost his life. At the very least, he had lost all of his cultivation. The emperor had once sent Eunuch Hong into the Fan Manor to check on his injuries. Given his great grandmaster strength, how could he not know what had happened? Furthermore, he was also someone who practiced the nameless martial secret. If there was anyone in the world who could break the side effects of the tyrannical martial secret, it could only be the emperor. However, he had still not said anything. If it weren't for Haitong's help, he would probably be lying paralyzed in bed and unable to rise for the rest of his life. Thinking of this, Fan Xian's heart chilled again. Father has returned to the palace safely. It seems that your mood is not very good. The crown prince, Li Changxian, sat behind a clean table with a warm smile on his face. He looked at Fan Xian and took a sip of the slightly cold tea. It was as if he was enjoying his last moments in the world. Fan Xian forced a smile. He kept feeling that he had heard these words somewhere before. It was as if all of his enemies could guess it. His mood was not good. The emperor will arrive in a moment. Fan Xian looked into Li Changxian's eyes. Li Changxian did not shrink back in the slightest. Now that things had come to this, he no longer had any other thoughts. A few days of house arrest was enough for him to think clearly about many problems. In particular, the successive deaths of his mother and aunt made his mood as clear as a cold pond. Everyone will die. Mother is dead. Aunt is dead. Li Changxian slowly put down the teacup in his hand and looked at Fan Xian. Father will also die in the future. It is just a matter of order. Fan Xian thought for a bit and quietly said, "The second prince is also dead." Li Changxian lowered his head. He had been imprisoned deep in the palace and had no idea what had happened these few days. He immediately raised his head and said with a complicated expression, "I have fought with him for so many years. I didn't think that in the end, even in death, we would have to fight to be first and last. We die first and go first." Li Changxian looked at Fan Xian and said, "Then, we will wait for you." Fan Xian smiled self-mockingly. He knew that they each had their own pride. Warmly, he said, "Then, you have to fight for a good position for me." Li Changxian waved his hand confidently and said, "When one is alive, one can be as lively as one wants. Death is a lonely matter. Of course, one has to fight for one's own position." Fan Xian was slightly startled. He thought a phrase in his heart, "Live together, die alone." When he had seen this phrase in his previous life, he had always found it difficult to express the hidden meaning in Chinese. Recently, he had seen countless people die one after another and heard Li Changxian's words. Only then did he understand that this phrase was just an overlay of countless realities. Fan Xian's heart suddenly tightened. He didn't know that in Hongguang Palace, the Empress Dowager had opened her eyes. He unconsciously looked in that direction with slight fear. If the Empress Dowager had truly woken up, he would probably be in big trouble. This fear came from the bottom of his heart. In the past, no matter who he faced, he had never been truly afraid. Now, he knew that the emperor was a great grandmaster. One person stood at the pinnacle of the martial realm and worldly power. What difference was there between him and a god who had descended into the mortal world? Immediately after, the ringing of the bells in the royal palace rang out and resonated in all directions. Fan Xian lowered his head and silently counted the number of times the bells had rung. After confirming the news of the Empress Dowager's death, his mood relaxed slightly. Immediately, it became empty again. Opposite him, Li Chengxian had completely different news. Hearing that the Empress Dowager, who loved him the most, had also left alone, his face was slightly pale. In a trembling voice, he said to Fan Xian, "There is no need to see me off." Fan Xian raised his hands calmly in greeting and said, "Go in peace." Li Chengxian's words were not completely correct. Death was indeed the loneliest thing in the world. But before death, it was often the most lively time in the world. An old man was waiting for the god of death on his bed, while his relatives and juniors surrounded the bed, chattering nonstop. It was very annoying. The Eastern Palace was also like this. Fan Xian waited outside the palace. After a long time, he heard the dense sound of footsteps. The emperor, surrounded by many people, came to the Eastern Palace and entered alone. Li Chengxian did not stand to welcome his father. He also did not hate the liveliness before death. He refused Fan Xian's suggestion to take a risk. He did not want to go to the ends of the earth to hide his life. He also did not act like the second prince and commit suicide by taking poison before the emperor returned. He had many things he wanted to say to his father. He wanted to vent the resentment he had held in his heart for 20 years. If he could not vent it all, he would probably become a resentful ghost after death. How will the history books describe this? Li Chengxian looked at his father, the most powerful ruler in history, without a glimmer of fear. If a person did not fear death, then they would not fear anything. The crown prince, who had improved a lot these 2 years, said straightforwardly, "I waited for you to come back because I wanted to know if you truly did not care about anything." The Qing emperor, dressed in casual clothes, looked calmly at his son and said, "The history books are always written by the victors. Furthermore, do you think I have wronged you in any way?" The crown prince sat behind the clean table and furrowed his brows in thought for a long time. He then smiled and shook his head. "Of course not. Mother was weak, but you still made me crown prince and let me sit in this position for so many years. Of course, you have not wronged me." This was not the truth because the thick mockery in it was completely revealed. The emperor coldly said, "Don't learn the cowardly and sour words of women." Cowardly? That was forced by you. You are too dazzling. No one dares to steal your glory. The crown prince closed his eyes and stubbornly said, "I have always thought of a question. Since you have never thought of passing your power to the next generation, why did you make me crown prince?" The emperor's expression was unusually calm. He stared at him and slowly said, "Chengxian, you disappoint me. All these years, I've been training you nonstop. What's the reason?" Chapter 587. Fan Xian walked out of the Eastern Palace and turned around to personally close the 2 heavy palace doors. He glanced at the densely packed crowd surrounding the Eastern Palace. His expression was calm, but an unknown emotion rolled through his heart. After he calmed down slightly, he waved his hand toward Eunuch Yao at the very front of the crowd. Eunuch Yao had accompanied the emperor through the difficult times on Dong Mountain. After Eunuch Hong sacrificed himself for the country, he had become the foremost figure in the Qing court. However, Fan Xian continued to casually wave his hand as usual. Eunuch Yao bowed and respectfully went forward to listen to the order. From this behavior, no one had any doubt that Fan Xian would have unparalleled power in the future. Fan Xian quietly said something by Eunuch Yao's ear. Eunuch Yao's expression was slightly suspicious. He didn't dare to question Fan Xian's orders. At this moment, he was unable to ask the emperor in the Eastern Palace. After some thought, he led the group of people outside the Eastern Palace to the outskirts, maintaining a long distance from the Eastern Palace. Fan Xian followed them to the side of the little forest in the palace. Looking at the quiet Eastern Palace from a distance, he guessed what the emperor and crown prince were talking about. Having the people in the palace retreat further was actually for safety's sake. He didn't know if the emperor would say something he would never want others to know once he became angry. This was also for his own consideration. Only a few people in the world knew the true reason the emperor wanted to depose the crown prince. This matter had been single-handedly woven by him. The emperor knew of his cultivation. If he stood guard outside the Eastern Palace and heard the dark secrets in the palace, no one would be happy. Fanxian pressed his dry lips together and looked at the Eastern Palace with eyes full of worry. He thought that Chengxian was soft on the outside, but hard on the inside. He was probably going to walk the same path as the second prince. Thinking about it carefully, he was actually a rather complicated person. The person who had forced the crown prince into a dead end was him. However, who would have thought that the situation would develop like this? The things he and Qin Pingping had done in secret seemed to be driving wolves to scare tigers. Unexpectedly, in the end, they had shaken out a true dragon. During these years, everyone by the emperor's side had either passively or actively stood against the emperor. Qin Pingping and Fan Xian finally succeeded in turning the emperor into a loner. Although he was loner and widowed, he was still at the top of the world. Furthermore, once his aura was released, it was as if he could swallow the sun and moon. Fan Xian couldn't help but feel a chill in his heart. The situation in the Eastern Palace was not what Fan Xian had guessed. The emperor and the crown prince did not sink into some hysterical family drama quarrel because of the first few words. In the real royal family, there would never be someone as excited as Ma Jingtao. There was only coldness, gloominess, calmness, and cruelty. The emperor sat casually on the stone steps with his legs wide apart. Looking at the door of the Eastern Palace, he thought of many years ago when he waited outside the palace doors for the good news of the empress giving birth. That day, there was a joyous atmosphere in the imperial palace. The Empress Dowager was exceptionally happy, but her own mood was also somewhat solemn. Only when the woman outside the palace, who was also pregnant, sent a letter did he become happy. He knew that the other party was indeed not an ordinary woman. She did not care about the dragon throne at all, nor did she think about seeking the seemingly alluring throne for the child in her belly. It was this attitude that made the emperor a little unhappy. After 20 years, this kind of unhappiness had long become a fading emotion. Occasionally, when he was in the little building in the rear palace and looked at the yellow-clothed woman in the painting, he couldn't resist grumbling. "Enji is your child, but is he not my child?" It had been 20 years. The child who was destined to become the successor to the throne of the Qin kingdom had grown up and was sitting by his side. His long hair fell softly behind his back. There was only calm and resignation between his brows. The child in the womb of the woman outside the Eastern Palace was now outside the Eastern Palace, standing in some corner and watching the movements in the Eastern Palace. The emperor unconsciously took the teacup the crown prince had drunk from the clean table in front of the steps and brought it to his lips to take a sip. He didn't know whether it was hot or cold. In the end, the Qin kingdom has not been founded for long. For some reason, the emperor chose to speak from here. Slowly, he said, "Although Northern Qi is only the second generation, it inherited the throne of the Wei kingdom. Its internal structure is much more stable. A dozen years ago, the Northern Qi emperor suddenly died. The empress was young, and the prince was young. If it had been in the Qin kingdom, I'm afraid that the attempt to force the abdication would have succeeded. Even if Ku He came out, it would not have succeeded." Li Qingqian's gaze landed on his father's hand, holding the teacup. "The reason it is like this is because the Qin kingdom has always been a country fought from the battlefield. The military is powerful, and we're used to using knives and swords to reason. Things like etiquette and the might of an emperor are not very convincing." The emperor's gaze was somewhat indifferent. Thus, to be the ruler of the Qin kingdom, one cannot be blindly benevolent. One must have iron methods and a tenacious nature. He turned his head to look at his son and said, "You grew up in the palace. When you were only 8, you already had the name of benevolence." Speaking of this, a glimmer of mockery appeared at the corners of the emperor's lips. "You just helped wrap the feet of a few injured rabbits, and those servants blindly tried to win mother's favor, saying that you would certainly be a benevolent ruler in the future. Blindly benevolent is cowardice. The Qin kingdom will unify the world. For 50 years, there will be endless strife. The old royal families everywhere will not be satisfied. I am only half a century old, but I have to lay down a foundation that will last for tens of thousands of years. I only had time to conquer this country. Guarding it requires you." The emperor pulled back his gaze and said, "A benevolent ruler and a cowardly ruler. How can you guard this vast land?" Li Chengxian glanced at his father. A self-mocking smile appeared at the corners of his lips. Only now did he understand that his father had been thinking about things decades later, over a decade ago. He had the confidence to unify the world, but he had to think about how the country would continue after 100 years. "That is why I brought Qingze out to fight with you." The emperor closed his eyes and slowly said, "Now that I think about it, at that time, you two were still young. I seem to have been a bit too hasty." Li Chengxian still did not open his mouth to reply. "I had wanted to see if Qingze, that child, would have any future prospects. However, in less than a year, I saw that his thoughts were too fake. As an emperor, he should have an awe-inspiring aura, but he did not." The emperor's eyes remained closed as if he was narrating a distant story. "Thus, I was determined to pass the country to you. However, in those years, your behavior truly disappointed me. You lingered around the flower houses and indulged in sensual pleasures every night, turning your body into something unrecognizable." Li Chengxian smiled self-mockingly and finally slowly opened his mouth. "Father, at that time, I was only 14 or 15. I was just beginning to understand the ways of the world. I wholeheartedly thought that you were going to depose me. I was terrified every night, so I could only find some feeling in a pile of cosmetics." Strangely, the emperor did not get angry after hearing these words. On the contrary, he smiled slightly and said, "Qingze was too restless, but he was clever. He finally saw clearly what I was thinking in my heart. However, he had already come out, so he could only continue walking. From this aspect, your second brother can be said to understand my heart deeply. Perhaps a knife can be ground until it breaks, but if it is not ground, it will never be sharp." The emperor opened his eyes and gazed calmly at his son. "The second prince didn't sharpen you. On the contrary, he ground you dull." Coincidentally, Enji entered Jingdo. Li Chengxian smiled and thought of the first time he saw Fanxian outside the courtyard. At that time, as the crown prince, he had never thought much of this assistant minister's son. Who would have thought that this assistant minister's son would, in the end, become his brother and become the hardest whetstone in his training for the inheritance of imperial power? "You've improved a lot these 2 years." The emperor sighed and slowly said, "I don't know if it's because you've matured at your age or if Yunrui has taught you many things, but everyone in court has acknowledged your identity as the crown prince. Your performance has also satisfied me." Hearing the words, Yunrui, the corner of Li Chengxian's mouth twitched involuntarily. Immediately after, he let go of his heart and smiled slightly with great courage. "You had me follow my aunt to learn political affairs. Naturally, there was some effect." The emperor did not get angry. He only lightly said, "It is enough for the so-called political affairs to be taught to you by the scholars Shu and Hu. In reality, you also know that what I had you follow Yunrui to learn is the art of scheming. Looking around the world, you won't be able to find many better teachers than Yunrui. How good it would be to continue like this," the emperor said quietly. "There are still many things that cannot be learned. When I am old, you should have seen many things. In the end, the heart of an emperor should also be refined. Only then will I be at ease to pass this kingdom to you." Li Chengxian's mood was a bit strange. Although he had been the crown prince since he was young, his father had always been too strict with him and lacked warmth. Thus, he had developed his timid personality. Although his personality had changed a lot these 2 years, it seemed to be the first time he had sat with his father like this and talked to each other. "And Ji has told me everything about the situation in Jingdo," the emperor said warmly. "Your performance was not bad. You behaved appropriately during the rebellion. However, there are a few problems." For the last time, Li Chengxian, as the crown prince, knelt by the emperor's side and bowed to ask for advice. There is no need for any warmth or fear in the struggle for power in the world. His own way led the imperial censor to defy orders in court. So you should have been beaten to death. The emperor's gaze was incomparably cold. And Ji convinced the civil officials in court to challenge you during the ascension ceremony. You should have killed him. He looked at his son as if teaching him for the last time. As long as someone is in the way, just kill them. On this point, you're not as good as Ji. The emperor continued, you didn't kill the 2 scholars of the Hall of Governmental Affairs and those civil officials, and only lock them up. What use was that? This is the biggest mistake you made in the Jingdo matter. If Yunrui had personally handled this matter and not you and Mother discussing it, perhaps Jingdo would have long been stabilized and the court would have been cleansed of blood. Fan Xian would not have had the time to act. Li Chengxian smiled bitterly and let out a long sigh. Gazing at his father, he quietly said, Father, do you know why I couldn't bear to kill those officials? Without waiting for the emperor to speak, Li Chengxian faintly said, Perhaps you have forgotten. At the beginning of your intention to depose the heir, it was these old officials who bravely stood out to oppose your edict and stand behind me to support me. Perhaps I am not a very powerful person, but I am someone who knows how to repay favors. Although the scholars who Enshu supported me for the sake of the country, I truly could not bear to act against them. The emperor was silent. No one knew what he was thinking. A moment later, he suddenly opened his mouth and said, When I decided to depose you, there were still people who helped you redeem it. Li Chengxian was startled. Immediately, an image rose in his mind. On the road to Nanzhao, the green banner that had been following the diplomatic group faintly rose. He asked in surprise, Fan Xian? He knew 13th Wang was Fan Xian's person, but he didn't know why Fan Xian had done this. It was not until the emperor pointed it out now that he couldn't help but feel complicated emotions surge through his heart. He didn't know that the private matter between him and the eldest princess had been single-handedly destroyed by Fan Xian. He mulled it over in his heart, and then thought of how Fan Xian had prepared to have him escape the royal palace at the beginning of the defeat. For a moment, he couldn't help being startled. The emperor narrowed his eyes slightly and said, Ji is a real person. Just like you, he occasionally has his true nature. I'm not as good as him. After a moment of silence, the crown prince let out a long sigh. He then stood and kowtowed very seriously to the emperor. Solemnly, he said, Father, I have always harbored resentment toward you. To be able to hear Father's instructions today, my heart feels much better. However, before I leave, I have something to say. Enough people in my family have died. Please, Father, be more lenient toward those who are still alive. Lenient meant that the emperor's methods in the past had been too harsh. The emperor's expression immediately became grave and stern. Hearing the words before leaving, for some reason, the emperor did not get angry. On the contrary, he looked at Li Chengxian with a complicated gaze. Slowly, he said, I promise you. A gust of early autumn night wind poured in from the north of the royal palace and whistled along the corridors and gardens inside the palace. It added a sense of melancholy. Live on. I can pretend some things have never happened. Losing one's mother was lonely. Old and without a son was lonely. In the battle that stretched from Dong Mountain to Jingdo, the Qing emperor had defeated 2 great grandmasters in a row. He had lured out and purged the restless elements in the royal family and military, and picked out the sinister traitors in court. In one move, he had established the great achievement of unifying the world. This grand situation that had been constructed for decades had become reality. Without question, it was the most glorious time of the Qing emperor's life. However, the empress was dead. The woman from back then had long died. The empress dowager had died. The eldest princess, who had accompanied the emperor for 20 years and sacrificed her youth for him, had also died. The crown prince had died. The second prince had died. Everyone had died. Only the emperor was left, a lonely and desolate man. The Qing emperor looked coldly at the letter. His fingers trembled slightly. With a rustling sound, the letter turned into a pile of white powder and slid down between his fingers. Blown by the autumn wind outside the eastern palace, it scattered in all directions like a bleak snowfall. A glimmer of pain flashed through his eyes. His brows were furrowed tightly. The words his two sons said before they died pierced deeply into this ruler's heart. The white hair on the middle-aged man's temples grew darker. His gaze gradually dimmed. There seemed to be wetness at the corners of his eyes. However, his body remained straight and strong, unmoving. The doors of the Eastern Palace once again closed tightly. No one knew what had happened inside. Everyone knew that the dethroned crown prince, Li Changxian, would certainly spend his last moments in this cold and cheerless palace. However, at some point, the royal palace's bell rang out again. Perhaps it was disdainful. It only coldly and emotionlessly watched his death. The emperor sent away all of the servants, leaving only Fan Xian to accompany him. Silently, he walked deep into the rear palace. Along the way, he passed the Chun corridor, the cold palace, and the overgrown weeds. Once again, he came to the little building that no one had come to for a long time. The father and son did not go up the building or look at the portrait in it. The emperor only glanced silently at the little building a few times. He then resolutely turned and left, following the path of autumn grass toward a place where no one was around. Fan Xian silently followed 3 steps behind him. There was a heaviness in the depths of his heart. There was no need to disguise it. It was truly heavy. Faintly, he could guess the emperor's current feelings. So many of his family members had died one after another. Although these family members were enemies he had to eliminate, no one could escape the ties of flesh and blood. The emperor was like a god, but he was still a mortal person. The Grand Supreme could forget emotions, but if he truly was the Grand Supreme, why struggle and struggle in this secular world? The successive deaths made even Fan Xian's emotions suppressed, much less the emperor. No matter what was said, this tired-looking middle-aged man was, in the end, a father, an elder brother, a husband, and a son. The two of them stood in the weeds up to their knees and maintained a tacit silence, looking at the quiet royal palace in the night. The emperor did not speak. Fan Xian was even more afraid to speak. He only carefully watched the expression on his profile. The emperor was silent for a long time and still did not speak. He had many things he wanted to say to someone, but Fan Xian was only his son. Let's return to the palace. Yes, Fan Xian replied. His expression was heavy. The emperor turned his head and happened to see this expression. His heart darkened slightly. His feelings toward his son grew increasingly better. Additionally, the crown prince's words earlier involuntarily made the emperor sink into deep thought again. After thinking for a moment, the emperor waved his hand weakly and said, "If you're still not feeling well, come into the palace and ask me." Fan Xian's heart jumped. He knew what these words meant. Just as he was about to say something, he found that the emperor had already turned and left. Returning to the royal study and eating some supper, the emperor felt a bit tired. Fan Xian wanted to leave the palace, but was stopped by the emperor. It seemed that he desperately needed someone to accompany him. After a while, Eunuch Yao came in and quietly said something. The emperor nodded and had Fan Xian return to his manor to rest. He would enter the palace to discuss matters the next day. Fan Xian accepted the order and left. In the long corridor outside the royal study, he heard a familiar sound. It was the sound of a wheelchair rolling on the ground. He knew the emperor was watching him from behind. In the dim light of the royal study, his expression was warm. He bowed deeply to the old man in the wheelchair and said, "You're here." Chun Pingping had finally returned to Jingdou, to the royal palace, and to the emperor's side. Just when the emperor was at his loneliest and most needed, the royal study was silent. There was silence in the royal study. The emperor looked at his most loyal official, his closest friend, and his most reliable comrade. He closed his eyes and said, "I have forced these sons too hard. Writing these chapters is mentally and emotionally tiring. In the end, I did not make the emperor shed tears. Crocodile tears cannot move people. Sometimes it is just a kind of self-pity and self-comfort. However, I truly admire people like the Qing emperor. From a certain point of view, he is the same as Yi Qingmei. They are both idealists. However, idealists do not necessarily bring about ideal results for the world. I'm a profiteer, so I can only keep a respectful distance from these kinds of people. Thus, I am very serious about getting monthly votes and fighting to be in the top 3 because of the 6,000 yuan bonus. Chapter 588. It's been a long time since I wrote this. Little cotton-padded jacket refers to true love for each other. I hope everyone likes this chapter. What Qin Pingping, sitting in the wheelchair, and the emperor, sitting on the throne, talked about that night would remain a mystery until many years later. No one had the right to listen. Even eunuch Yao, who never left the emperor's side, was the same. This conversation was actually similar to the 2 conversations outside the royal study within a year. The words came from the emperor's lips, entered the official's ears, and did not pass to a third person. However, the President Jingdo had long known that the events of the past few months had all been secretly planned by the emperor and Director Chun. The 2 of them were only waiting for the enemy hidden in the dark to jump out, and then capture them all in one fell swoop. The Qing Emperor and Director Chun working together was truly too powerful. They were able to keep the entire Jingdo in the dark for half a month. Only now did people remember that many years ago, Director Chun had accompanied the emperor in his great undertaking of unifying the world. The old man in the wheelchair had saved the emperor a few times, and the emperor had also given him the greatest trust and honor. The older generation had never doubted Chun Pingping's loyalty to the emperor. This was a fact that had long been proven by history. It was only now that it was once again reflected. There were many speculations in the hearts of the people in Jingdo regarding this conversation. That night, when Fan Xian left the royal palace and hurried toward his manor, he did not pay attention to the conversation in the royal study. He also did not think that this conversation would have anything to do with him. He guessed that the emperor was just a bit lonely, while Qin Pingping was playing the role of a loyal official and temporary friend. The reality was not far from his guess. From a certain point of view, Fan Xian and his old emperor were truly similar. If the Qing emperor was the best actor in the world, hiding it from the world for 20 years, then Fan Xian was the second best actor, hiding his thoughts in his heart and hiding it from the Qing emperor. This was an unprecedented battle of acting skills. It was a battle of the heart. Fan Xian lifted the curtain of the carriage and stared in a daze at the silent and uneasy Jingdo night streets. He thought gloomily that he had obtained the emperor's absolute trust. He had won another battle in this battle, but why fight? How would he fight in the future? The worry and anxiety on his face were not faked, but came from the depths of his heart. Especially the complicated joy, worry, and bewilderment between his brows completely expressed his current mood. Brushing past the wheelchair, Fan Xian lowered his head in greeting. He saw the glimmer of warmth and congratulations in Chun Pingping's old eyes. He immediately understood that Cece had indeed been taken away by the director. Since he had already returned to the capital, Cece had also returned to the manor. However, he didn't know if she had given birth or if it was a boy or a girl. Thinking of this, how could he still be in the mood to think about the conversation in the royal study? His entire heart had already returned to Fan Manor. He urged his subordinates to whip the horses pulling the carriage. However, too many people had died these few days. Even though he knew that he might have become a father, Fan Xian only felt a faint satisfaction and not too much ecstasy. One was grieving the death of her birth mother in the manor. After she returned to the manor, she didn't know how to deal with it. The carriage did not stop at the front gate of Fan Manor. Instead, it went straight in through a side alley and stopped at the corner gate left specially for the back garden. Without waiting for the carriage to come to a complete stop, Fan Xian had already jumped down from the carriage. Smiling, he glanced at the wife of the Tung family, who was welcoming him happily at the gate. He then walked toward his own manor. After a few steps, his smile disappeared. It was not that he was purposely putting on an act. It was truly because the arrival of a new life could not wash away the smell of blood brought by so many deaths in Jingdo. Walking past the flower hall and into the east wing, he was not surprised to find that the lights were still slightly lit. His father and Lady Lu were waiting for him in the room. The dim light shone on Minister Fan's face, illuminating his wrinkles and the joy in them. Minister Fan was looking at a baby in Lady Lu's arms. Although he managed to maintain the appearance of a stern master, he could not hide the joy in his eyes. When Fan Xian entered, he first bowed to his father and Lady Lu. He did not glance at the baby in Lady Lu's arms. Instead, he turned his gaze directly to the side of the bed. He saw Wan sitting by the bed, holding Cece's hand and quietly saying something. Wan Er's eyes were red and swollen like pink peaches. She appeared very pitiful. Her face had also become much thinner and looked haggard. However, she forced a smile and chatted idly with Cece, who was lying on the bed. After Fan Xian paused slightly, he walked over. Not caring that the two elders were in the room, he sat directly by Wan Er's side. With a face full of smiles, he looked at Cece, who was leaning against the pillow. He looked at the girl of the past and said, "You're already a mother. Why aren't you sleeping so late?" Although Cece had been frightened during the month she was about to give birth, she had the protection of the Overwatch Council. She had been taken to travel around Jingdo by Old Chun and had never been exposed to a cold. She had exercised more than a normal pregnant woman, so she looked more energetic than a normal pregnant woman. In addition, this girl had grown up with Fan Xian and had been influenced to be free and at ease. She had a broad mind and did not become haggard because of the birth of the baby. On the contrary, her face had a bit more plumpness. She looked more like a lovely young woman. "Young master, you sleep all day. How can you sleep?" Cece was still used to calling him young master. Her brows were full of joy and the pride of being a mother for the first time. However, she forcefully restrained her words. Although her personality was relaxed, she was not a heartless idiot. She knew that too many things had happened in the capital. The young mistress's heart was filled with grief. She did not want to display too much at a time like this. However, after the young master entered the room, he did not even look at the baby in Lady Lu's arms and came to the side of the bed. Cece began to ponder in her heart. Could it be that she had given birth to a daughter and the young master was not happy? Her eyes dimmed a little. Even though Fan Xian was clever, he was still unclear about the thoughts of the women in the back of the manor. Looking at the girl's expression, he thought she was sad because she had no one to accompany her during childbirth. He smiled and prepared to open his mouth to comfort her. He didn't understand, but Lin Wan would understand, and Lady Lu would also understand. Seeing Lady Lu carrying the baby over to the bed, Wan Er smiled and gave Fan Xian a look. Quietly, she said, "Go look at the girl." Fan Xian was startled. He turned his head and saw Lady Lu looking at him with a slightly reproachful expression. Only then did he understand where the problem was. He smiled bitterly and took the baby from Lady Lu's arms. Carefully holding it in his hands, he looked at it and found that the baby in the swaddling clothes, the little baby girl, was not good-looking. Not only was she not as good-looking as Fan Xian, she was also not as good-looking as Cece's big eyes. As he looked at her, he couldn't help but laugh. He felt that he was being a bit silly. A newborn baby naturally could not be said to be good-looking. As long as it was healthy, it was fine. Lady Lu and the other three women saw him carelessly take the baby and were startled. They did not react and looked at him nervously, afraid that he did not know how to hold the baby. Lady Lu was about to reach out and snatch the baby back, but she did not expect Fan Xian to bend his left elbow slightly and support his neck with his arm. His right hand lightly clapped. Seeing this, everyone let out a sigh of relief, including Minister Fan. They all looked at Fan Xian in surprise. Wan Er, who had been depressed for a long time, could not help but secretly laugh. At this moment, Fan Xian only cared about looking at his daughter. How could he care about how others looked at him? He did not think that in this world, there were very few men who were willing to hold a child, especially in a rich family like theirs. Furthermore, he was so familiar with it, like he was an old nanny. Everyone was stunned. Fan Xian held the baby and spoke gently to Cece. "The situation has been unstable lately, and it has been hard on you. But you know me, It is not that I do not look at the child when I enter the house because I do not like my daughter. It is just that in my eyes, children are not as important as adults. Your safety is the most important thing. Having been secretly reprimanded by Lady Lu and Wan Fan Xian naturally knew why Cece had been sad. He smiled and explained a little. He did not take it to heart, but he did not think that when his words fell into Wan and Cece's hearts, they each had different feelings. Cece's heart was filled with sweetness. She thought about when she was young, and how her young master had always muttered that giving birth was the hardest for a mother, and that giving birth to a boy or a girl was the same. Although she felt sweetness in her heart, she did not dare to show it too much in front of Wan. She knew that the young mistress had always been very kind to her. Furthermore, these 2 years, she had wholeheartedly wanted a child, but she had always, thinking of this, Cece missed the last 2 sentences of Fan Xian's words. She carefully glanced at the young mistress, who still had her head lowered and was smiling warmly. For some reason, her heart ached and she felt sad for the young mistress. The women's thoughts were complicated, but Fan Xian held his daughter and looked closely at her. The more he looked, the more he liked her. When he had entered the room earlier, he had only cared about Cece's body and Wan emotions. He had not thought much of his daughter. Now that he held her and felt the softness of this little body through the cloth, he looked at the wrinkles on his daughter's forehead and watched his daughter occasionally purse her lips. His heart grew softer and softer. This was the biggest difference between men and women. A woman had been pregnant for 10 months before giving birth to a child. They had already nurtured feelings for the child for 10 months. In addition, they had put in a lot of hard work and pain. Naturally, they had a strong, indescribable warmth toward their child. A man's feelings, on the other hand, needed to be watched, held, and experienced before they would grow stronger. Particularly for someone as busy as Fan Xian, he had not been by Cece's side when she was pregnant, so he did not have strong feelings for this child. However, as he held her, the feeling came. Fan Xian held her more and more carefully. He stared in a daze at the little girl in his arms and thought, was this my daughter? In the future, she would definitely be very beautiful. In the future, she would definitely be very shrewd. In the future, these tightly shut little eyes would also grow bigger and bigger, becoming more and more beautiful. After his heart softened, it gradually became sour and sweet. For some reason, Fan Xian felt his nose was a bit stuffy. This kind of feeling was too complicated. Even he didn't know what words to use to describe it. He only knew one thing. His 2 lives, which had been filled with calamities and great luck, had finally been extended in this world. In this moment, he thought that even if he died on the spot, he would have left something in this world. It was different from looking at the rows of books in the Jingdo government's Sun family. This kind of feeling was stronger, more alive, and more strangely moving. After holding for a while, Wan who was watching from the side, took the child under Lady Lu's guidance and Fan Xian's demonstration. She held the child in her arms with heartache. According to the rules of this world, this was still her child. This kind of heartache was real. Fan Xian smiled slightly and looked at the pity and glimmer of curiosity in his wife's eyes. Only then did he remember that his wife was not very old. Under his care, she was not much different from a young girl. However, seeing Wan holding the child, it seemed that some of the pain in his heart had lessened slightly. He felt much better. It was already late at night. Everyone was a bit tired. However, this was the first life in the 3rd generation of the Fan Manor. Everyone was excited. Even Minister Fan did not shy away from staying in the room. He happily watched this scene and refused to rest. In the end, it was Lady Lu who said a few words and had the old nanny and wet nurse, who had been waiting outside, come in. Holding the child, she stood to the side and urged everyone to rest early. As Minister Fan was leaving, he suddenly thought of something. He prepared to call Fan Xian to the study to ask about the situation in the palace and the emperor's mood. Immediately after, he remembered that the child had been mentally and physically exhausted these days. With great difficulty, there was a joyous occasion. Why disturb him? So, he didn't open his mouth. On the contrary, When the two elders left, Fan Xian happily asked, "Father, when I was in Jiangnan, I asked you to name her. What name did you give this girl?" He asked happily, but Minister Fan glanced at Lady Lu with a complicated gaze. Shortly after, he calmly said, "As a girl, there is no rush in choosing a name. First, you could just call her by a nickname." Fan Xiaohua. Fan Xian smiled and said, "You've thought of a nickname a long time ago." After these words were said, Lin Wan and Cici were both dissatisfied. They wondered how someone of their status could have such a common name. However, Cici didn't dare open her mouth in front of everyone. Want to notice the old man's expression. Her heart jumped, but she didn't say anything. Fan Xian and Wanna met each other's eyes. Only then did they remember something. Their expressions did not look good. After Minister Fan and Lady Lu left, he couldn't resist shaking his head and sighing. Looking at his daughter in the old nanny's arms, he said, "Will this girl's name also have to wait for the palace to bestow it?" Hearing this, Cici jumped in fright. What kind of explanation was this? Immediately after, she thought of the young master's other identity and quickly pressed her lips together, not daring to express any opinion. Linwan gazed at him and quietly said, "I heard the old master say that back then, your name was also given by the palace. I think it's not just a name. At the latest, the emperor will have you bring the child into the palace the day after tomorrow. Bestowing a name is a matter. The palace will probably send a group of old nannies and wet nurses for you to choose." Fan Xian raised his eyebrows and smiled coldly. "Those old bastards in the palace, if they come, then they come. I'll just raise them alone." Now he had the confidence to speak. He was someone who dared to slap even the Empress Dowager, let alone those old fish eyeballs. However, after these words were said, the nanny in the east wing holding the baby girl became afraid. The wet nurse behind her lowered her head and didn't dare to breathe too loudly. Fan Xian glanced at them and calmly said, "I'll have to trouble you to take good care of the young lady, but there's no need for a wet nurse. Tomorrow, the mistress will speak with the mistress." Lin Warner glanced at him with confusion. What was her husband doing? Why was he kicking out the wet nurse? She watched as Fan Xian sat back down on the bed. Smiling, he asked Cici, "Is there milk?" Cici blushed slightly and nodded. Fan Xian smiled and said, "Then it's settled. The child has to be raised by herself. What's the point of having a wet nurse nurse the child?" Fan Xian thought, how do you people know the importance of breastfeeding? How much does colostrum sell for in the world? The doctor had said that the psychological effects of a mother breastfeeding a baby, he knew that no one in the world would understand these things if he told them. So he didn't discuss it with the two women and made his decision. The wet nurse to the side lowered her head and didn't dare to say anything. She thought to herself, what's wrong with a wet nurse? The reason the Fan family was able to prosper was because the ancestors in Danzhou had nurtured a few children of the royal family. The old nanny heard something else and looked at the young master, dumbfounded. Was the young master going to let his aunt raise the young lady herself? That was against the rules. Tomorrow, she would have to talk to the master and mistress about it. Fan Xian didn't know what the old woman was thinking, but he didn't care. He had worked hard in this world for 20 years. If he had to let others talk about how he raised his own daughter, then he would have lived his life in vain. He sat by Cici's side and said a few more words. He found that the girl was sleepy and forcing her eyes to stay open to talk. He couldn't bear it, so he smiled and said, "Hurry up and go to sleep. In the past, when we were in Danzhou, you were even lazier than me." Seeing Cici's hesitant expression, Fan Xian smiled and said, "You've been in the capital for a few years, and you've become muddle-headed. When you were little, I said that giving birth to a boy or a girl is the same. Although it's not a national policy, it's a family rule." When they returned to the master bedroom, a servant girl who had been rubbing her sleepy eyes brought hot water and prepared to serve the two masters to bed. Fan Xian waved his hand and shooed them out. He helped one sit on the side of the bed and looked seriously into her eyes. He said, "I know the rules of the manor. The children of the mistress have to live with the first branch." Tears swirled in Lin Wan-er's eyes, but they didn't fall. These few days, she had suffered many blows. There was a lot of sorrow in her heart, but she had nowhere to pour it out. Cece had returned home today. Although she remembered that the baby girl was Fanxian's flesh and blood and was happy in her heart and even faintly grateful to Cece, the emotions in her heart were incomparably complicated. In particular, Fanxian faintly revealed that he didn't want her to participate. After a few mixed emotions, it made one sad uncontrollably. She was of noble birth and had a strange background. Her personality was like ice and snow. Her naivety was mixed with a hidden intelligence. In the end, she was still a woman. Any woman would always have a woman's meticulous thoughts. Fanxian looked at her calmly. He knew that the eldest princess's death, the second prince's death, and the bloodshed of the royal family had already made it difficult for his wife to bear the burden. Using the softest tone he could muster, he said, "You're thinking about it the wrong way, aren't you? I just don't want those nannies to taint our child. This child is still ours, but Cece is her birth mother. We can't just carry her over like this." Lin Wan sighed and gazed at her husband's face in front of her. In a quiet voice, she said, "You don't have to be so careful in front of me. I know you're worried about me." She forced a smile. "However, sometimes I do feel a bit jealous. Like the things you and Cece sometimes say, I don't really understand. Something about national policy or family rules or something." Fanxian smiled helplessly. After all, Cece had grown up with him. Just like how he used letters to educate his younger sister, there were some things that belonged to that life. He held his wife's hands and quietly said, "In the future, I'll tell you everything. Only we know. If other people want to know, I won't tell them." He paused and held his wife's hands tightly. Smiling, he said, "I'll tell you everything about carriages, bridal sedan chairs, cars, and cannons." Linwarner was confused. She knew about carriages and bridal sedan chairs, but what were cars and cannons? She knew he was trying to coax her, so she forcefully hid the sorrow on her face. Lowering her head slightly, she said, "I actually want a child. Looking at my brother's current situation, I don't know what will happen in the future. With a child, I'll have one more hope." These words were spoken lightly, but it made Fanxian's heart ache, particularly as he looked at Wan'er's slightly thin face. Compared to 2 years ago, she was much thinner. Compared to Cece on the other side, it was as if she had just given birth and lost her body. He felt even more pity for her. He knew what his wife was thinking. Furthermore, the development of the medicine should be almost complete, so he had a lot of confidence. With a teasing tone, he said, "Of course, we have to have a child. Let's give little Hua a little brother. This house will be lively." One only thought he was coaxing her. She smiled and didn't say anything. Fanxian looked at her furtively and said, "However, it seems there are many steps to having a child. Speaking of which, we haven't been intimate in more than half a year." Lin Wan smiled and spat at him. Shortly after, she remembered that her husband was purposely teasing her. Thinking of his kindness and attentiveness, she felt even more sorrow. Fanxian was only joking. So many people had died in the palace. How could the husband and wife be in the mood to do such things? He stood and brought over the basin of slightly warm water. Placing it in front of the bed, he directly took off one of her shoes and socks, giving her a fright. "I'll wash your feet. Running around in and out of the palace these days, you must have suffered a lot." Fanxian lowered his head and placed his wife's bare feet into the basin. Stirring up the hot water, he gently rubbed them. Lin Wan looked at his hair and felt the threads of warmth coming from her feet. Her nose ached, and she began to cry soundlessly. Fanxian lowered his head. Without raising it, he knew she was crying. He knew his wife's pain, but he couldn't find any words to comfort her. He could only silently help her wash her feet. Uncontrollably, there were countless more sorrows in his heart. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.